my computer all of a sudden decided to do an automatic upgrade, so I'm waiting until it gets through that. So start, I'm here. I'm just
okay. Sorry, Catherine.
So who are we missing? Catherine?
Catherine's on her way.
Okay.
So I think we will begin, and she's going to join us momentarily. Okay, so good evening, everybody. Welcome. It's so nice to see everyone. And I will make a motion for the board to return to public session. If I could have a second, please. Seconded by Julia. Thanks so much. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Terrific. And it's Thursday, September 24th. Welcome to this regular meeting of the Board of Education. If everyone would please join me by standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag
of the United States
of America
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Terrific. Thanks so much, everybody. And thank you to Kim and to our entire team for putting this together. We're getting better and better at coming back together in person, and it's good to see everybody. We're looking forward to an opportunity to have conversation about board goals for the year and to hear an update on our reopening. Before we do that, I think we'll just briefly go around for any board announcements. I wanted to just begin, and I'm sure other board members will want to share their perspectives also, but by thanking our administrators and our staff for not only all of the tremendous work that has enabled us to successfully bring students back to school, and which we mentioned on the very first day of school when we were last together, but also for the creativity and thoughtfulness that went into curriculum night this past week. Our administrative team offered remarks live. Our staff went to great lengths to provide video clips by way of introduction. All of this is just uncharted territory, and we really appreciate the creativity and effort that went into ensuring that parents felt as if they had an opportunity to meet all of you and to spend some time with all of you. And it was just very impressive. So we sincerely thank you for your efforts to introduce yourself to parents in addition to all of your efforts to support our students. I'll also just acknowledge, with the board's permission, that it was surreal to attend these programs in the absence of the rest of the Katona-Lewisboro community. And I'm sure we all experienced to some extent the same feeling of missing our fellow community members at those programs. It was just a reminder of where we are and how creative we're going to have to be to remain connected and to find opportunities to come together in new ways, one of which is PTO meetings, which are still happening in a more social manner. And so thank you also to our PTO organizations for their incredibly creative and dedicated efforts to, again, keep parents engaged and informed. Everybody's working so hard and working together in the same direction to support our students and our families, and we're very grateful. I'd like to pause in case other board members wanted to offer any remarks or had additional announcements.
I don't have an announcement, but I did want to say, despite the fact that I do miss being in the schools for curriculum night, the 3 students that I have at home are happy to be back in school, even 2 days a week. And I think, that gives me the sense that all of this hard work is going to pay off for our students. And I think that's what it's all about anyway. So thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
Marjorie, I'll just say I had also intended to make a couple of remarks about curriculum night, which I thought was really splendid. I thought, obviously, there's a lot of work went into that. I'm sure the administration, the building administration had a pretty strong hand in influencing how that worked. But I thought the teachers in particular on the videos brought really, really positive energy. And it was really great as a parent to go through that and to at least virtually get to meet the teachers and to understand sort of their plans for the curriculum. It was really, really well done. I think it's worth repeating what you said. So great job by all on curriculum night. I thought it was very, very well done in these troubled times. It's good to see that there's a little bit of normalcy, even if we weren't here in person.
Thank you, Rory. And actually, you hit on something that you reminded me. There were so many positive messages from teachers. And you could just hear in their words the ways in which they're speaking to students about these circumstances and how they propose to help our students get through it academically and through a social emotional lens. So yeah, well said, and thank you. If there aren't any other comments at this time, I just also wanted to briefly thank everyone at this table on behalf of the board, also for our board development earlier this week. We really appreciate the opportunity to come together and have a very thoughtful conversation. And thank you for the planning and time that went into that. And thank everybody for your thoughtfulness. And with that, I think, Andrew, please, we are eager to hear from you. If you'd like to offer board announcements in addition to, I know, what is going to be your update momentarily, or perhaps we just want to transition to that. You're muted, Andrew.
Thank you. I want to, well, thank you to the board members for those very kind remarks. We really appreciate it. And I want to also offer thanks to the entire community. I think it's important that we just keep saying thank you to everybody for the enormous undertaking that everyone continues to be involved in, our staff, our students, our community members, our parents, everybody. It just continues to be a huge effort. Actually, now that we're back and it starts somewhat quickly to feel in some ways sort of normal again, a little bit. It's interesting to drive past the parking lots at the train stations in the morning and see that they're still almost totally empty, and realize that so much of the world is still operating very, very differently. And of course, we're operating very differently than we used to in the past also. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of that regularly. Our teachers are working very, very hard still to recreate school in ways that are entirely different from how it's ever happened before. We're appreciative of their efforts. We share, collectively sometimes in some of the frustrations and things that either don't go quite the way we wish they would because there's a new piece of technology or there's just something we've never done before with students in our classrooms and at home at the same time. We're aware that some of the traffic isn't quite what we wish it would be at the moment, and we're looking at to see if there are alternate ways to bring cars and buses into the campuses and out in the mornings and the afternoons. We're going to keep looking at all of these things. And I worry honestly for some of my colleagues who have very high expectations for themselves, and they want the work for themselves and for their students to be as good as it's always been, and they want the pace of work to be what it's always been. And we actually collectively have to keep saying to each other, it can't all be. We're working very, very differently, and we're reinventing this each day. And I know that everyone is doing the very best they possibly can. And I can't say often enough how much we appreciate that. The Wednesdays so far have proved to be enormously helpful to staff. They have a lot to learn on those days with one another, with the technology. And so we appreciate the community's patience with those days. We know we'd rather have our students in school, quite honestly, yet another day, but we also want to serve them as well as we possibly can. And those days are helping us enormously in that regard. It's interesting also how quick we can be to say, okay, so we've got this down. what's next? You know, what are we going to do differently next week? And we have to remind ourselves it hasn't been very long yet. So we do want to keep working at these things. We know there's room for improvement in the current practices before we make changes. Having said that, I do want to remind our families that we did say that in terms of the models that we offer, we asked families to make a commitment for September and October. And appropriately, families have reached out to us and asked, you know, so when would we let you know if we're thinking about a change? So we want to let families know we're going to reach out to you very early in October and ask you to let us know only if you're thinking about a change. So if you're in, you know, a model at the moment, if you're in the hybrid model and you just want to stay in that model, or if your child is at home full time and you just want to stay that way, you won't need to respond to us. But if you want to make a change, we'll ask you to let us know, and we will be reaching out to you to let you know exactly when that is. We expect it'll be early in October to give us enough time to see what the response is, because then that will in turn gauge our response. So we don't know exactly how things will play out until we know how many people are interested in making a change, but we're confident that we'll be able to accommodate in some way families' wishes at that point. Again, you know, on the whole, we're really pleased that things are operating and students are coming in every day, and knock on wood, that we've been safe and the protocols are working pretty well. You know, as I said before, they can get better. We're still bringing people in to watch some of the work we're doing around traffic, for example. We're having someone come and look at that with us tomorrow to see if we can find some better ways of doing that. And that's true of everything that we're doing. We'll keep making efforts to improve it. But on the whole, we are pretty happy. I say that somewhat hesitantly because I know there's always exceptions and there's people out there for whom the experience is not what they would wish it to be. We welcome input and feedback always. We appreciate the emails that sometimes let us know things that we might not know about. So we appreciate those emails that come in to let us know when something isn't going the way perhaps it should. And we respond as quickly as we can to make it better. So again, I can't thank the community enough. And I do want to mention that we heard today that Somers High School is closing for a couple of days. Tappan Zee High School also closing for a couple of days due to positive COVID cases. Bedford had a case. I confirmed just a few moments ago they're not closing. They did have a case, but because of the timing and the particular location, it's not necessary for them to close. But I think it's important for us to pay attention. All of those districts have very similar protocols to us. They're all doing the very best they can. They're all working enormously hard. But I think it serves as a reminder that we can't relax. We have to keep following through on all the things that we're doing. As I watch the students walk past my window here at the high school each day, I'm really happy to see all the masks being worn. We watch the screeners come in the morning, and on the whole, we're doing a pretty good job with those screeners. I don't want to say it's perfect because it's not quite perfect. So I'm going to keep encouraging us. Let's not relax on those screeners because they serve a really important purpose. We want our families every morning to be thinking, is our student well enough to come to school? And if the answer is in any way, shape, or form no, please stay home. As much as you want to be here and as much as you want to see your friends and your teachers, we want to stay open for as long as we possibly can. So please pay attention to those screeners. Think about the questions they're asking you. Don't feel pressure to be here for any reason. If you're not feeling well and you have to answer yes to any of those questions, we ask you to stay home, and we'll be in touch with you and we'll follow up and we'll get you back as soon as we can. But it's just going to continue to take that kind of collective effort and attention for this to continue working as well as it has so far, and then to get even better in time. So I think that's really it for my update now. I know we've got other probably longer conversations to have shortly.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
Any questions, comments? Okay, does that bring us to 7.02? Are we moving now into our discussion of board goals? Was that the update on reopening?
Yes.
Andrew? Okay, terrific. Thank you. Just wanted
Sure.
to clarify because
Yeah.
we flipped from board announcements into that. Great. Okay, so at our meeting 2 weeks ago, we had just preliminary conversation around the 2 board goals that we've maintained for a number of years now. We agreed that we would give the goals some thought and revisit them this evening. One option available to us is to acknowledge that these goals have served us very well for a number of years. And perhaps we should acknowledge that regardless of how we proceed and move forward. But we could leave the goals more or less as they are. However, it was my sense, even from the preliminary conversation we had the last time, that we might want to slightly modify the goals to reflect the unprecedented nature of the work that has been undertaken to support students both last spring and prospectively this school year. So I'm happy to turn the floor over to all of you for thoughts and suggestions. You'll see I think we have some draft language that you can refer to in board docs, if that's helpful to us as a starting point. And we can go from there. Yeah, Terrence, please.
So I agree that the goals from previous years have indeed served the board well. While I've been on it the past 2 years, and I think previous to that, the proof is in the pudding, as they say. It's, you know, districts have done really well. I will say I really appreciate the additions in the draft. I think they are succinct and still very concise and speak to exactly what you're referring to, which is, you know, the spirit of the times that is still in line with the ongoing work that the district is committing itself to, in, you know, as evidenced by the creation of the equity and racial justice group. And, you know, and again, I think just the way the district and the board has been very, you know, forward in its presence in supporting this type of activity as related to equity and racial justice. So I personally appreciate that that addition to the goals, and I would be happy to support them if that were the case.
Okay, thank you, Terrence, for that comment. Maybe just to clarify for any members of the community who are listening but who wouldn't have seen the draft language, we're talking about our leadership goal, which is the first of our 2 goals, the second being a goal related to fiscal stewardship. And at the moment, we're talking about slightly modifying our support of Andrew's work, which is to say the focus on the learning commitment that we've maintained for a number of years, but to modify it in 2 ways so that that learning environment reflects what I anticipate is going to need to be very thoughtful, careful decision-making throughout the year to provide the best possible educational experience for all students in response to new risks and new opportunities. You know, I don't think we're finished with that work. We may be at the very beginning of it. And then also to acknowledge, as Terrence has mentioned, our shared responsibility to promote equity and justice for all in preparing students for our democracy. So that's the nature of one possible proposed modification to the leadership goal. And then the board would continue to receive an update from Andrew and would engage in its own board development in support of this goal. So with that, I've given you all even more time to think about your own thoughts and questions and comments. Yes, please, Liz.
Before I even looked at the draft of the updates, I had written down the 2 very points that have now been included. I worry sometimes about getting too granular with goals and too specific because, you know, as we've learned in the past year, there's so much we can't predict. But I think that these do incorporate some high-level ideas that we should be focusing on in, you know, these times.
Thank you. Yes, Roy.
Yeah, I agree with what both Terrence and Liz said. I do think that both bullets are poignant and timely. I'd given some consideration to the second goal, the fiscal stewardship goal, just with the same purview of justice and equity and the changing environment that we have. And I actually felt that the existing goal, and this is a testament to how well I think it was written originally, in its sort of long-term vision, does deal with safety to some extent, to a fiscally responsible budget, which I'm a little concerned about, given funding from New York State and so on. There's a lot of unanswered questions for the year we're heading into. But I actually felt good that the existing wording adequately meets what I was concerned about. So I just wanted to say that while we're talking about the leadership goal, there is the fiscal stewardship goal as well. But I don't think that any changes are warranted there, and so I feel very comfortable with the revised draft wording. Thank you for including in particular, the inequity and justice bullet there. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you, Lori.
Can I just ask that maybe we consider in the third bullet of the fiscal stewardship goal that in addition to managing the human resources and infrastructural resources in a responsible, safe, sustainable manner, whether we might want to add just the word equitable, and maybe equitable in place of responsible, so that it's not four things. I don't know whether people would be, I think it just carries it through, it expands the commitment that, it might require, let's say, for example, some training in human resources that we invest around equity. And so I think having it be part of that goal sort of allows us a framework to do that.
Yeah, I consider, I don't disagree with you. I think that's fine, Julia. I had felt that both the word responsible and the consideration of demographic trends might cover that adequately, but sure, I don't see any reason not to add that.
I agree with all of the above. I would keep the word responsible. I think it's different from equitable and, sort of responsible in terms of fiscal prudence. So in terms of the first goal, I think the additions, I agree with what's been said. They look good.
Great. Thank you both. Any other thoughts or comments at this time? If there aren't, then I think what I'm hearing is that perhaps we add the word equitable to the list, separated by commas, in the third bullet of the fiscal stewardship goal. So managing the district's infrastructure and human resources in an equitable, responsible, safe, sustainable manner. And other than that, perhaps no other changes, which is great.
To the draft, meaning to incorporate those new changes that were in the draft.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we're fortunate that we're seeing our work in a unified manner. That's great. And I think later in the consent agenda, we'll have an opportunity to vote on a resolution for the new board goals. Kim, I'm looking at you for a nod. Is that what we're doing tonight? No. Want to clarify for me?
They'll go on the next meeting for adoption.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Terrific. So is that all you need from us then tonight? Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. All right, moving right along then to 7.03. Rory, can I ask you to speak with us about the Finance Committee charge?
Sure. Thank you, Marjorie. This year I have the honor and privilege of chairing the Finance Committee. And so over the past couple of weeks, I have been thinking about what an appropriate charge for the Finance Committee might be. I've worked with Danelle, the Assistant Superintendent for Business. Thank you, Danelle, for your input, and some others to consider both the objectives and the charge that we took on last year, and do that with a consideration as to whether it was completed, and whether we wanted to consider similar goals or objectives for this year. I'll just quickly mention, I'll just quickly sort of highlight what we have actually landed on, which is primarily to look at options for the Lewisboro Elementary School as well as the Shady Lane property. We obviously have a number of options open to us as a district for those properties, and I think it's a good opportunity for the committee, including community members, to consider what the appropriate options might be and what our most likely scenario might be for the long-term usage or otherwise of both Lewisboro and Shady Lane. So that's our primary charge. The secondary charge is quite closely related to what we took on last year. So the district has got a number of options when it comes to healthcare. We last year thought that our rates were escalating higher than we might have anticipated and that other plans may have been preferential. Although maybe just a few months into our analysis when we had seen the actual rates, we realized that that wasn't the case. And so we switched out of that role, out of that charge into the second charge from last year, which as soon as COVID hit, that sort of got tabled. So I do think there may be an opportunity for us to continue to review the health insurance rates this year and to monitor them closely. And should they begin to increase, we think that there may be opportunities to look at other, I'll say competing, but other healthcare opportunities and to see whether or not there might be some savings to the district there. And then the third charge, as I think is typically the case, is really to, if we've managed to accomplish charge number 1 and number 2, we will look at various budget analyses to find other opportunities where the district may look to save money or to reduce its overall cost. And we leave the option there, number 3, to, if 1 and 2 are completed, to pick something else up. And I think that's typically the charge. So I feel pretty comfortable with that. I think Donnell felt comfortable that they were appropriate. I might just mention that we did give some consideration to whether it was appropriate to add a charge around COVID and the costs and potential cost synergies associated with the COVID pandemic. We felt that that was just normal business for the district, that it wasn't really something that was appropriate to hand to the Finance Committee. And so we kept that off the list. So this is the list we've landed on. I'm not sure. I don't think we vote on it tonight. I think maybe this is the first read through and we vote on it some other night. I'm not sure of the protocol, but I'm happy to take any questions or considerations from anybody.
Thank you so much, Rory, and thank you, Donnell. Questions, comments? Terrence.
So I'm just looking this through, and I think these are excellent. This is an excellent focus for the group. I just want to kind of, because I'm looking at the language and it says review fiscally responsible option for Lewisboro and Shady Lane. And I'm pretty sure this is the case. I'm pretty sure like what we have happening there now, especially at Lewisboro, it is responsible, right? It's not like we're not being responsible with the property. So I don't know if we need clarifying language or not, but I just felt kind of compelled to make that statement that, the building is not in an irresponsible status right now.
No, that's absolutely right, Terrence. And we certainly didn't mean to suggest that. And maybe we can revise the language slightly in case that's the implication. We, under no circumstances, are thinking that it's fiscally irresponsible the way in which it's being managed currently. In fact, it is very fiscally responsible. And it certainly is an option to continue to do what we do. That's one of the options that the committee will consider. There are clearly other options. And so I think it's just a thorough review of what are those options and what are some of the costs or benefits. I don't want to come to any conclusions before the committee does its work, but I completely agree with you that the way in which we're handling Lewisboro at the moment is fiscally responsible.
Right, and you may recall that the lease expires at the end of this fiscal year. So this is a good opportunity to make sure that what we're doing with the building is fiscally responsible. And in the event that the town or the other CCC doesn't renew the leases, what would our other options be?
I appreciate the clarification around Lewisboro currently. I'm okay with the language as is, but I definitely understand the potential ambiguity. So Rory, Danelle, would you like to amend it slightly? What's your preference?
I'm trying to find some words that make sure that it's clear to everybody that we don't think it's fiscally responsible.
Okay. So I think we can just maybe take that offline and you'll bring us the language the next time and we'll be ready to adopt the charge. I'm not hearing any other comments or questions. Thank you so much. That's great. So this brings us to public forum. I'm not sure whether anybody is waiting to make a comment. I'll just mention for anyone who might be waiting that we can use the Q&A. And it looks like we do have one comment coming in. And perhaps community members used the email address beforehand. I'm not sure. So I'm just going to pause for a moment while community members might be gathering their thoughts. And then we're going to ask Kim to help us out. And she's going to read the comments and questions that have come in. And after we turn our attention to the consent agenda, we'll have an opportunity to take up any questions or comments in board dialogue. I'll just mention if you could please identify yourself, provide your name and also where you live. That would be very helpful to us. And I think we're ready when you are, Kim. Thank you.
Okay. I'll start with, there were 2 emails received to our public forum email, and I will start with those. So one comment is from Colleen Harris. Please explain and expand what equity and justice goal is and means. And then the next comment is from Jeff Holbrook. 2 children in the district, John Jay High School. With regard to JV sports and the stipends for JV coaches, first off, I'm very pleased to know and wholeheartedly agree that the primary focus of the administration and BOE is to keep our schools open and offer our students a safe and exceptional education. I had the opportunity today to watch the September 10th meeting. I very much appreciate all of the thoughtful discussion around prioritizing student safety as the district considers its participation in extracurricular activities, athletics. On the surface, I can understand the theory that by eliminating JV offerings during the pandemic, we are reducing the number of kids being exposed. However, there are some unintended consequences that were not discussed at the last meeting, which I think require further consideration. Most students, in lieu of JV participation, will instead now participate in some form of youth team. Using soccer as an example, for both boys and girls, our in-town travel program has stepped in to fill the void created by the lack of a JV team. While it is completely appropriate and acceptable for youth soccer to do this while following appropriate safety precautions, it is inevitable these players will now be exposed to a new set of teams from various towns in the surrounding area, likely a different set than the JV varsity team will be exposed to. These students will still be attending school at John Jay High School. Wouldn't it instead be safer for those students who would play on the JV team to be exposed to the same group of schools as the varsity team? One other consideration, parents of JV players will now be required to pay a fee for students to participate in youth sports. Accordingly, these parents are paying school taxes to support varsity coaches, JV coaches helping with varsity, along with a separate youth sports fee. This doesn't make a lot of sense. I hope you'll reconsider your decision around JV sports. As you are aware, most Section 1 schools are fielding JV teams, and we should as well. Again, thank you for all you have done thus far to get our schools up and running successfully and safely. It is my hope, above all else, that they continue to stay open. And then I'm just going to check the email. Okay. And these are from Liz Bickler. Hello, this is Liz Bickler. Apologies if this was already covered as I entered late, but I have a few questions about the hybrid school situation. Can you please address what is occurring on Wednesdays and what visibility parents and citizens will have to the benefits of the Wednesday remote days? Can you please address what the next steps are for school? Is there any plan to have children in school full-time at any point this year? Particularly, is the board and administration doing anything to try to find more space in order to get more of the younger children into school 4 days? I just caught the tail end of the discussion around Lewisboro Elementary School, so I apologize if this was already discussed, but can you please address what the thought process was to come to the decision to not open LES for school, but to lease it to Parks and Rec and CCC for distance learning at a cost to families? And those are all the comments at this time.
Great. Thank you so much to our community members for your questions and comments. As I mentioned, after we work our way through the consent agenda, we'll have an opportunity for some board dialogue. And thank you so much, Kim, for helping us out with public forum. So this brings us to our consent agenda. And I know we have a resolution to suspend the APP process. And I don't know that we need to vote on that separately or pull any items out of the consent agenda. I anticipate we're going to have some conversation, maybe more broadly speaking, revisit the conversation we had 2 weeks ago about our plan to bring back athletics. But I think we can just do that after the consent agenda is on the table, unless anybody objects. So if not, would somebody like to move the consent agenda? Thank you, Bill. Moved by Bill, seconded by Catherine. Thank you so much. And now why don't we pause for some conversation. And I see Christian McCarthy has joined us.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christian. Welcome. And I'll turn it over to you, Andrew, to begin. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I hope this is the right spot in the agenda. We actually have a small presentation to share. Maybe it should have been earlier in the meeting, but I think it's fine where it is now.
I think it's fine. It's
okay.
fine.
So, and Christian, thank you for joining us. I'm going to share the screen and put some slides up. We really appreciated the questions that the board had at our last meeting, and we wanted to expand on some of the thinking that was shared there, some of the questions that were shared there. Is everybody seeing the screen? Great. And I'll start with some opening remarks, and then certainly Christian has much more expertise in this area. But I do think it's important to say that athletics, like everything else, is more complicated than it's ever been before, and any decisions that we're trying to make are different than they've been at any other time. And I think it's also fair to say that everybody comes to this conversation, or it's likely that there are as many different perspectives on what should be happening with sports as there are on what should be happening with schools and how schools should be working, and on so many other aspects of our lives at the moment, and understandably so. And I'm not going to say that any of those perspectives are right or wrong. I think there's a lot of validity and a lot of different perspectives, and there's also not an obvious right way to move forward. Right? There's a complicated way to move forward, and we're doing our best to think through it. And we really appreciate the opportunity to think through it more with our board tonight, and to share a little bit more comprehensively our thinking with you, and how we reached some of the decisions that we did and why. So here are some of the questions that we hope we'll be able to answer for you tonight as best we can, but also to hear more of your thinking. Why are we moving forward with any sports in a COVID environment is a question that some people have asked of us, and it's an appropriate one. And we'll speak to that one a little bit right away. And then these other questions: why not move forward with all sports? How best to decide, and who has the authority to decide which sports, and how best to balance health and safety with equity, inclusion, and opportunities for all. I think some of the information in the presentation to come hopefully will speak to some of those questions, and then we certainly welcome more questions. In terms of that first one, and Christian, I'll speak a little bit, but then I welcome you chiming in. Sports, obviously, like all extracurricular activities, and I actually do want to say right off the bat that when we talk about extracurriculars, we're not just talking about sports. We are looking to bring back other extracurricular activities for all of our students. We've posted club advisor positions, a great variety of them. We know there's conversation going on in schools about theater and music and art and other very important extracurriculars. And all of those things we know are incredibly important to students, to their lives, to their interest in school. And sports is one of those that develops, helps our students to develop their teamwork, their skills, their health and fitness, their mental health and well-being. You know, all of those things are incredibly important. Some of our students have been playing sports since very early in their lives. It's become a really important part of their lives. Something that in many cases they hope will continue for a long time to come. We certainly hope they'll continue staying healthy and well for the rest of their lives. And so it's for all of those reasons that we think about how to continue it after not being able to participate or going all the way back to March. It's been a long and difficult stretch for many. So Christian, I don't know if you want to add to any of those first remarks about why we even think about continuing with sports at a time like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the social emotional standpoint, this is such a big part of the kids' experience. And when we can create an environment to do it as safely as possible, I do think it's something that our student body will greatly appreciate. I know it was a very difficult spring for our seniors as they left, not being able to participate. And now we're looking at a junior class that now lost both their spring and now with the delay that they've been faced with so far. So as much as there's uncertainty in it, I think that the plan allows for something that'll be really special for the kids to experience. And I think that's what we're trying to accomplish.
Thank you, Chris. So we're now going to show you some other slides that we think will address some of the other questions, but also please, to the board members, please don't hesitate to stop us at any point if you want to ask questions at any way along the way. We thought to give some overall information might be helpful. Christian, if you want to speak to, how some of these things work.
So basically, we work under a number of guidelines. The New York State Public High School Athletic Association is our governing body. All member schools must follow their rules. They set the standards for what can be done. Then at the section level, the section has the ability to then make it more restrictive, but they can't make it less restrictive. And then again, you move to the local district, like our school district. A perfect example is our athletic placement process. We don't have 7th graders participating in the process and have the ability to play at varsity sports, but the state does allow you to allow that to happen. So individual districts have the ability to create some additional standards as long as they're not lessening. They have the ability in just about every case, except for a case we'll talk about later tonight, to make them more restrictive. So we go through a series of checks and balances, and basically what's happened this year, which we'll get into later slides, each one of these categories, as well as the governor's office and the Department of Health, have played a role in the process and landscape that we're currently in. I think when it comes to the difference between interscholastic athletics and intramural sports, that's a question that comes up quite a bit. The intramural piece is strictly allows students to compete within. It's in a recreational sense that takes place. It doesn't allow for schools to compete against one another. It doesn't fall under any of the guidelines from New York State Public High School Athletic Association or the National Federation of High Schools. It's strictly what is done in-house. And there really are, the only limitations that you have to that are the grades that you cross over with. For instance, you wouldn't have middle school kids participate with high school kids in an intramural structure, but you would have grades 9 through 12 together in a similar structure. When it comes to interscholastic athletics, they're competing against other schools. They're following and falling in line with the NYSPHSAA guidelines that are set. And most of those sports, that, with the exception of a couple that follow NCAA rules, you're following the National Federation of High Schools guidelines, which creates a whole nother standard in which for us to govern the actual sport itself. So where NYSPHSAA will set the guidelines across the board for the state, the National Federation will speak to the rules within a particular sport.
So Christian, one of the questions on the table tonight, which I know we'll come to later on, is if we were to choose to have JV sports, to offer them now, as some other districts are, those JV sports would have to follow all the guidelines provided by NYSPHSAA and by Section 1. You couldn't offer JV sports and do it in your own way, right? You'd have to do it in the same way as all those other districts.
Yep, you have to fall in the line with NYSPHSAA.
Okay. So we've had some questions about, are there options to move sports to different seasons? These questions all fall under the guidance that Christian was just referencing. Seasons and which sports happen in which seasons, that's all determined at the state level. And you see some of the decisions that have been made more recently on this slide, with NYSPHSAA first deciding that the season would begin on September 21st, but then more locally, Section 1 pushing it to the 29th. More recently than that, the Fall 2 season was created to move some of those high-risk sports, football, volleyball, competitive cheerleading, into this. It's called Fall 2, but it takes place in the spring next year. Again, so once that decision is made at the state, Section 1 can't reverse it and put those sports back. The state makes that decision, and then Section 1 lives within that decision. And more recently, girls swimming also moved into the fall.
Andrew,
Chris,
Can I ask a question?
yeah, and Chris, if you need to correct me on any of this, please
yeah,
do.
just so, because there are what you said is correct. With the move of football, it does not allow us to participate in football in competitions, but some sections have made decisions to move particular sports just in their section to a certain time of year, which is out of sequence with New York State and would not be able to follow a lot of the state championships. So there is a scenario like years ago, we might have played girls soccer as a spring sport where the state championships were taking place throughout the state as a fall sport. And then after legal issues and things like that, this section then moved it back. So there is a scenario where that can happen, but what Andrew is referencing is correct in that once the state deems a sport cannot be at a certain time, we do not have the ability to then compete during that time.
Thanks, Christian. There was a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. So these decisions are already made. The
Correct.
state has said that football is going to March.
Correct.
Football has been moved, yes.
And
Okay,
some,
so at some point, will we hear which sports are on the table?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can tell you that now. And we should also say that just as we were approaching the opening of school and there was new guidance coming out each week and each day, the same thing is happening with sports. So the last bullet point you see on this page about modified sports, that just came out within the last day or two from our own section. So the situation, as we've noted before, continues to evolve. So there was discussion about modified sports. And just as of, I think the press release, yesterday, modified sports have been canceled for the fall season. The sports that are on the table, which we'll get to in a minute, for the fall this year are boys and girls soccer, field hockey, boys and girls cross country, and
Tennis, girls
tennis. Girls tennis. Thank you, Christian.
Yes, volleyball and football have been moved together. And now after yesterday, girls swimming, which was approved to start, was moved because of the lack of available facilities across the section for teams to compete in.
So as I was saying a moment ago, lots of guidance coming down from the state, just as it did around the opening of school. This is now some of the guidance around sports. Christian, do you want to talk us through some of the particulars that have come out?
Sure. So the big piece is which sports were permitted to start. And it's been a rocky road in that, much like what's taken place for our schools, the lack of information or clarity coming down to us from the governor's office or the Department of Health has created some gray areas. The reason they allowed the low and moderate risk sports. So, I've gotten a lot of questions like, how is soccer permitted to play in this environment, and how is it, so much different than because of its level of contact? And that's simply because the New York State Department of Health has categorized it as a moderate level sport. And once it falls into that category, it is allowed to participate in its normal fashion pretty much when it comes to the ability to compete. So the low and moderate risk sports are the ones that we're looking at. They're the only ones we're allowed to compete in. So they are the ones that we're setting. We still have to fall in line with many of the same things you're hearing about every day that are taking place in our schools when it comes to the social distancing. We have cohorting that's taking place. We have ways to try to encourage face coverings throughout, and we'll talk more about face coverings because that's going to be quite a bit when it talks about unable to tolerate a face covering. So I'll get into that in just a minute. But basically, you know, athletics, as we know, it's going to look very different. It's going to look more spaced out. You're not going to see the same type of reaction and cohesiveness and closeness that you might see build within a team because we're keeping socially distant. We're not high-fiving. We're not shaking hands after a game as sportsmanship has us do in past years. So it's going to look a little bit different from that perspective. Everyone engaged with the event or practice will be in face coverings, from the coaches to the trainers or anyone else working in the proximity. The biggest piece that has been coming out, that has been our biggest gray area, has been around face coverings. The Department of Health has stated that face coverings are to be worn unless the person utilizing them feels that they cannot tolerate them during exercise or during the competition. So, and then they're allowed to take them off. So that obviously creates some real concerns for schools when you're talking about us being in face coverings throughout the day and now moving into an environment where they're no longer required. Although being outside does have some benefits, the contact of a sport then alleviates some of that because of the nature of the game. Where are we with it? Well, Dr. Casaro the state has come down, I guess the best way to say it, in saying that at this stage of the game, our advice to everyone and working with the state's attorneys from NYSPHSAA are saying to not be more restrictive at this point. It's too gray of an area, and that there are potential risks of liability that a district could take on by creating a more restrictive requirement for face coverings. In addition to that, the section then came out from their executive committee with a very similar statement in response to the states, and saying again, we do not recommend schools, or the section won't take a stand on it, and that the schools should be very careful in moving to a more restrictive policy and should be in contact with their local Department of Health to determine if our interpretation of tolerable is acceptable. So then we can work through that. With that being said, depending on where you live in the state of New York, the Department of Health has given different information. So that has made it increasingly more complicated. Although no area are they looking to get behind anything in writing, which is a little more concerning. The other piece that comes into play is Dr. Casaro has weighed in, who's our school doctor. He's a school doctor for a large number of schools in our area. And that the policy that we were putting together as a group of schools and conferences was that face coverings would be required at all times. If a student athlete felt that he or she could no longer tolerate, or they could no longer tolerate the wearing of the mask, they would remove themselves from the game, practice, or competition, move to an area that was established as a socially distant place for them to safely take their mask off. They could kind of get themselves together, take the necessary face mask break, and then put the face mask back on, return to the team, and then return to the game, practice, or competition. Where we fall with that is, although we have Dr. Casaro saying that is an appropriate interpretation of the Department of Health's guideline, we don't know that that'll stand up with the Department of Health. So we are still awaiting further information before we can fully commit to what face coverings will or will not look like. It is possible that you can have a scenario that many of you may be seeing in your local youth leagues, and that masks are not being worn at all. So, you know, during competition. Outside of competition team meetings, yes, masks could be put back on. But if the tolerable piece is pushed and the Department of Health does not allow us to create that our interpretation to be realized, then we could be looking at a situation where masks will not be worn at all. So during competition. So like Andrew says, this is constantly changing. He's been on meetings with superintendents. I've been on meetings with athletic directors. We've been with the NYSPHSAA. We've been with the section. And every day it's something starts in a good direction and then gets very gray when it comes to our ability to actually enforce it based on concerns around liability and the potential health impact on the student athletes participating.
Thank you, Christian. So we wanted you to see on these slides, and there's a little bit more here. Christian's mentioned the cohorts already and some of the record keeping that has to be done. There are lots of new protocols that obviously need to be followed around athletics. And when we recommended last week to the board, the movement of some of those coaches who otherwise would have been working at the JV level, it's our thinking that there's so much more supervision necessary at the varsity level that this would be a way to make it safer. But that's certainly one of the things that we want to talk about.
And just real quick, I did want to mention, when we talk about cohorts, we don't want to give the impression, because it wouldn't be real,
right?
That the cohorts are developed within the team. They're not following the cohorts coming from school. So the cohorts will become mixed, and then the coach will create the coach will create cohorts within the team to minimize the overall direct contact between student athletes during practices and things of that nature. So what you might see in a typical practice is you'd come out to the stadium. A soccer team was practicing. They would have the one cohort on one half of the field, the other cohort on the other half of the field. They would go through their stretching and skills and drills, maybe some different 3-on-3s or different types of things within that cohort. And then they would combine cohorts for any type of scrimmaging that would take place in preparation for games and things but you would work to minimize that. So when we use the word cohort in this realm, I don't want to give a false impression that they're in the same cohorts that they were during the school day, because that would not be the case. And it's just in an effort to limit the amount of direct contact between student athletes.
So I have a quick question on that, Chris. Why would we not attempt to maintain the cohort A cohort? We put so much effort into bringing kids back into the school Monday, Tuesday, and then a separate cohort Thursday and Friday, in order to maintain their social distance. And in the event that there is an issue at the school, it's likely going to be contained to a single cohort. Why would we not try to carry that through to our athletics? Aren't we surely undermining a lot of the good work that we've done by allowing our cohorts to mix when they're at practice?
I mean, it's a great point, but what I would say to you, there's no way. So we don't know how many members of cohort A are going to try out for soccer and then make the soccer team. So cohort A might have 17 kids and cohort B might have 5 kids, which would make it pretty difficult for them to run practices and prepare for games. The other part that becomes inevitable, in order to play in a game, the team is going to have to combine. If it doesn't combine, then they're not going to have roles. They're not going to, you might have defenders on one side. You have to have offensive players built in on the other. You have goalies over here. The cohorts may not permit that to take place. So it's inevitable that they're going to have to combine at some point in order to train or participate, similar to what you're seeing in your youth organizations. So our goal is to limit, but because of the reality of it's going to be very different for every program where the kids are, what cohort the kids are coming out of, that in itself creates it. You're also going to have a scenario where you have freshmen or sophomores that are now on the same team with juniors and seniors. That's going to cross cohorts as well. So even if you stayed in our current cohort system, they would be crossing over with kids they don't normally have classes with because of the grade differences.
I'm sorry about my interposing before, but this stipulated that sports are very important to a lot of people and are part of their lives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Absolutely stipulated. Not arguing that. But we are going through such gyrations to the point of keeping people at home and doing remote learning. They can't be within 6 feet of each other in chemistry class, but they can be less than 6 feet apart when they're playing soccer or field hockey. That makes no sense. And biologically, this makes no sense. I mean, the virus is the virus. It doesn't care, if it's for a really good reason or not. I just think this is, if we do this, and if and when we get some cases, it's going to be hard to explain, I would think. I just think it's undermining all the other work, and to me, it doesn't make logical sense to restrict who can be near who in academic classes, but that doesn't apply to, because the rules say, with soccer and field hockey, unless it's a core activity. Well, yes, players get very close to each other, certainly within 6 feet. In terms of the mask thing, I don't know about liability for making people wear the mask. I would worry more about liability for people not wearing the mask. And if I agree, I mean, I stated my opinion about the whole business, but in terms of the local mask rule, I think that's mandatory. If the mask is so intolerable, then you can't play the game. To say that you can't, wear the mask unless it bothers you. I mean, that's not a biologically sound thing to do. So I don't know how other board members feel, but I think you got to think very carefully about doing something like this.
Bill, I just wanted to touch base on the one comment you made, because, and I don't in any way disagree with your comments on mask wearing. It's something Andrew and I have been pushing within our groups. What we're hearing is that the Department of Health guideline may not permit us to mandate it during competition and during intensive work and intensive gameplay. And that's where a big concern comes in from us. And that's where the state currently and the section are saying, their lawyers are saying, you're putting yourself in a situation, because if something happens to a student wearing a mask who said that it wasn't tolerable, it could create this situation. So that's they're coming down saying, you don't have the ability to make the Department of Health's guideline more restrictive. That's what they're telling us, and it's what we're fighting against in the same way that you're stating tonight.
Well, then that goes into the decision. If it turns out that if you're going to play, you have to play by those nonsensical, or at least non-biological rules, and that only strengthens my concern about this whole operation. Because having students that close to each other without masks is, it makes absolutely no sense.
Why don't we?
I think Liz is waiting to just
sorry.
register a comment. Please, Liz.
Just a quick question to make sure I understand. So there's a question of the Department of Health's guidelines that we can't mandate masks, but I thought we had said earlier that the Department of Health had set down this criteria and we could become more restrictive, but not less. So I'm not sure how that squares.
That's a perfect question. And it's what I referenced before when I said, we have the ability in just about every case to make it more restrictive, except for the one we're going to talk about tonight. And that's when it comes to the Department of Health. And they trump us, and we don't have the ability to change their guideline.
Chris, I'll just echo the points that Chris has made. He and I, as he said, we've both been in many conversations with every conversation I've been in with superintendents in our region. They've all wanted to say, we'd like to mandate masks. It makes sense, as Bill was just saying, it's the most sensible thing to do. And we want to have agreement that would be agreement across all the schools. A school doesn't want to play another school if one school is enforcing the masks and the other school isn't. There's so many reasons to do it. But as Christian points out, there is this one sort of stumbling block right at the end of the conversation, where the state's language has this word tolerable in it. And I think part of the question is, how does a teenager judge appropriately when it's tolerable or not for them to wear it? And some of us would like to say we think they've got that judgment, and they could, but then when lawyers become involved and they say, well, we're not sure you want your liability resting on that piece of judgment, and that you want to be mandating that, it becomes a more complicated conversation. So I think it's still being had, the conversation, and maybe there'll be some resolution in the next couple of days, as there has been on some of the others, but it's also possible there won't be.
If I can just speak to this, just to clarify, I think part of the risk is that atmospheric oxygen is at like, I think 20 to 21% normally. And if you're inside of a mask, you potentially reduce the oxygen inside your mask to like somewhere in the range of what I've just read some articles about this. So it's like 15 to 17%, which is like being in a high altitude situation. So the risk involved is that if we have students who have low oxygen and something happens, I believe then because we've mandated that, that's where it becomes problematic for us.
But if I could, but the policy that Chris said was then the player won't play.
Right, no, I'm just telling you
why.
why.
With a mask, gasping for your life. It's saying that if for whatever reason you can't handle the mask, okay, but then you can't play. And that's not putting them at risk. That's not in danger. It might make them unhappy, but it's not putting them in any increased danger. We're not saying you have to run around with the mask on. We're saying if you can't do it, then don't run around.
I think perhaps we should just try to make our way through a few more slides and a few more questions and points, and then maybe circle back. Is that okay?
Absolutely. So here on this slide, you see some of the thinking on our part as to how we landed at the place of saying we think just doing varsity and then bringing in some intramurals makes more sense. We think it follows some of the same logic, although you're hearing tonight why it's even more complicated, but it follows some of the same logic that we brought into the approach towards opening schools. The hybrid model limits the number of students in school, and we were thinking to limit the number of students playing sports so that we could better supervise all these new protocols that have to be in place, so that we can cohort, again, as Christian points out, not the school day cohorts, but the type of cohorts that the state sports authority is recommending for practices. There are issues around facilities. With our varsity teams, we can maintain them all here on our campuses, on the fields that we have available. If we were to introduce JV teams, now you're going to be requiring travel to places off-site. The transportation is something of an issue because of the social distancing necessary on the buses. We're already going to need more transportation just for the varsity teams. So we're concerned about the amount of transportation for the JV teams in addition. But we are going to speak to, later on what could be necessary for JV if the board would like us to think further in that direction. But you also see on here under transportation another concern about the fact that students are under the current model, and this is the way all schools that we know of are doing it. Student athletes are responsible for their own transportation to practices on days that they're not physically present. So that's another challenge when the students are younger and they can't provide their own transportation, and families now become responsible for getting them here on days when they're not in school. You can see the next bullet point about costs associated with game management, which we'll get into in a bit more detail in a couple more slides. And then you can see the cohorting that we've already talked about. This is now the school day cohorting that does get mixed even by the varsity, only obviously gets more so if there's also JV. So that was our thinking around health and safety as to why just doing varsity seemed to make a little bit more sense than doing both. And then we were thinking we would bring in intramurals certainly at the middle school as we have in the past. And if there's interest at the high school, we could bring in perhaps some intramural sports there also. Christian, did I leave anything out on that slide, or should we keep moving forward?
No, we can keep moving.
Okay.
Because it'll come out in discussion anyway.
Yeah. So here, I think we've touched on a number of these. These are some of the protocols in terms of the best ways to keep students as safe as possible at the games. You've already heard about masks.
Andrew, I can kind of jump in because I can fill those through pretty quickly.
Great.
So what we will be requiring is that all coaches and student athletes do take part in a secondary health screening prior to the start of practice, along with a temperature check. So we have students who, yes, took one in the morning, but our concern is that as the day goes on, symptoms could arise during the school day for a student who has been infected or is just not feeling well and has just a regular day-to-day virus that they might be dealing with. So we want to keep a real check on that. To do that, they would do a second health screening and a temperature check prior to being able to participate after school. The coaches would have to do a screening as well, which included a temperature check. And then our remote students who on those days are then coming into school for the first time, so they would have not have completed any health screening on that day. They would then have to do a health screening in order to practice that afternoon. When we talk about hydration plans, we can no longer supply water bottles because they can no longer be shared. So all student athletes are responsible to bring their own water bottles. We do have filling stations, in our in the foyer of the gym that are no touch. So there would be the ability to refill, if you were in a close proximity, and we will be working with our athletic training staff to develop that same type of protocol throughout a game if a student athlete had gone through their water already. But they would be required to bring their own bottle in order to use that. We are talking about, even in games, mandated mask breaks that would just delay the game, which similar to what we do with games that we play on really hot days. When we're in competitions, even at the state level, they'll stop a game for a water hydration break for student athletes. We would do something similar built into our normal games moving forward. The other big piece is when you talk about attendance, we'll get into the spectator conversation in a little bit. But when you talk about our facilities and you're looking about if you are restricting attendance in any way, you're talking about a much larger manpower involved to cover. The stadium alone has 4 ways to get in. So you'd have to monitor each of those 4 areas in order to do the proper health screenings. And then there are requirements now also from the Department of Health that limits only 2 spectators per athlete. So that's another piece that has to come into play. And we'll get into the whole conversation about spectators in just a minute. So I think that pretty much covers that slide, Andrew.
Thank you, Chris. We've gone through, I think, the additional thoughts on face coverings. So now we show you some data on this slide. Chris, you want to take us through this too? Yeah, sure. So one of the things that kind of gets skewed with some of this, when we look at our plan going into this, was, hey, we want to make sure we can do the best possible scenario, create the best possible environment for our student athletes, especially our senior class, who has obviously just missed their spring season, to give them the best opportunity to compete, even if it's in this new environment. And in doing so, the thought was, in thinking about creating cohorts and then skill development and trying to, with all the limitations, still make it a really special experience. The thought process was, by bringing up the JV coach and putting them into an assistant role, you now have 2 coaches working with each cohort, with the head coach going back between cohorts, or even the ability of further splitting a larger group, which also would seem to make a lot of sense. So you're talking about in a year like now, our varsity, when it comes to a sport like cross country, we normally have very large numbers on our cross country team, probably up around 50, 55. We have had more in a given year, but that number is a little skewed because that's covering varsity, JV, and freshmen, and there's multiple races that can be built in. The varsity team only consists of actually 7 athletes that are able to actually score during a dual meet or an invitational that our kids participate in. We are moving to a strictly a dual meet schedule now for cross country, but you're looking at, by setting that up, we could probably maximize with the 3 coaches having about 15 to 18 athletes per team. That means boys and girls would have the similar amounts, when normally you're looking at about 12 student athletes at the varsity level that are actually part of the varsity team in a typical year. And then you'll probably see a larger number, we'll say around 20 or so at the JV level, but that's also freshmen as well. So they'll run in a freshman race, even though they're not designated on a freshman team, and they're still accessing the coaching staff that's at the varsity level. So it's a little bit of a different animal. Boys soccer, we normally have, boys and girls soccer and field hockey, we normally have a head coach and an assistant coach at the varsity level.
and then a single coach at the JV level. In our plan, the thought process was to, by allowing that varsity coach to come up, it speaks to what I talked about earlier with how practices and different things could be run, but it also would allow us to take a little bit larger roster that we can work with on our campuses and within our cohorts that we create within those teams. So now, you know, you're talking about, you're looking at, wow, 24, 26 kids, but now in a cohort of 12, that's really a much more manageable on one side of the field. And then the same thing happening on the other side of the field. So you're taking in, you know, maybe anywhere from 4 to 6 more student athletes than you normally would, because our varsity program in a normal year will be anywhere between 18 and 20 kids is usually where that max cap is. And then at the same thing at your JV level, we try to take a couple more kids when possible, but because it is a single coach, you are limited to how that works. So when you look at boys soccer, girls soccer, and field hockey, they all really fall into a similar category, and they're designed in a similar fashion. And what we're looking at, our goal was to take a few more student athletes at the varsity level to be part of that experience, because of the reality that kids could be in and out, on and off rosters, as well as coaches could be in and out. We really have no idea how this will play out. And we still are creating an adequate supervision, but at the same time, we can enhance our skill-based instruction and maintain cohorts for longer periods of time and more successfully. When we talk about girls tennis generally likes to be in the range of 14 to 16. A lot of that's tied to simply how many courts we have, and you want kids playing, you don't want them watching. So they're generally in that range. So you are limited as far as how much you really can expand that. You know, I put the number of 16 to 18. Could they carry as many as 20 if there were 2 coaches working with a team? Yeah, because you can create teaching courts, and you'd have 2 coaches able to do teaching courts and still have 4 other courts available. Once you move to the JV model, that second team would have to go to Fox Valley in order to train. And the one piece that I just want to throw in here, Andrew, that we didn't talk about is because of the late start of our season, and we're talking about this season could go as late as Thanksgiving in the way we're currently set up with when playoffs and things take place. Daylight savings is going to become a major issue for us because we only have the 1 lit field. So it's really going to limit what we're able to do. And we might have to split a varsity tennis team match between two courts, meaning maybe singles are taking place at the high school and doubles are taking place at Fox Valley, just to fit those games in before dark. So that's going to be another major obstacle that comes our way in the coming weeks. That daylight saving falls into, you know, it's getting darker earlier and earlier, and then it drops off. We're still competing, and the stadium will work great, but our fields without lights will really be limited as far as time.
Chris, it's Rory. I'm trying to wait until we come to some sort of conclusion here, but I can't help inserting my opinion at this point. I'm not really getting clarity. It feels like there's a foregone conclusion here that we are not going to run JV sports this year. And I'm not getting a good sense of why that is. And I understand what you're saying here, but you're using an example of we're going to have some set of kids on one end of the field and another set of kids on another end of the field, and therefore we're taking up more space, and therefore we need more coaches. I'm just wondering on what scientific basis that is, that if we have 13 kids on one end and 13 on the other end, and how far apart are these kids, and will they be apart for the entire practice? And how many fields do we have, and how many days a week are we using all of those fields, and so on. I'm not quite buying into the logic that, oh, you know what, we can only run varsity because we have to have practices on opposite ends of the field.
Aurora, I think you're misunderstanding the purpose of the presentation, because it's not about buying something. It's about, Andrew and I came to the Board of Education with a plan that we discussed in the last meeting. We're trying to explain the thought process behind that plan, because that's what was put in question, and that's what people a lot of wanted answers to. So we felt that it was imperative for us to take this time to go in detail of why we recommended this in the first place, because a lot of the questions were around, how did we get here? What is the thought process of why?
But I'm not seeing that
why
answer
we're not
here, Chris.
having JV and other schools are having JV. So that
I'm not seeing the answer here. So you're predicating it all on the fact that we need to separate the varsity, that we're only going to run varsity. We need to separate the varsity kids during practice.
No,
But I need to
I'm
understand
explaining that it
what
comes
on what.
in two forms, and I'm explaining that the New York State Public High School Athletic Association is recommending that cohorts be put in place to minimize the contact between student athletes throughout practices.
Right.
There are supervision pieces that come into play for that are very different. If you're a single coach at the JV level, that's going to be pretty challenging to run two different groups simultaneously when you can only be in one place at a time.
Interesting. So is the restriction that we don't have
around that?
Yeah,
The board still has
that we don't have enough
choose what they
coaches
would
at
like.
the JV level, or is the restriction that we don't have enough field space?
When it comes to field space, we have the two turf fields, which are best competition spaces. The middle school field is a very limited field because of the issues that it has that we're trying to correct. So it does have many limitations. It does not handle water well. We are in the middle of actually going through a whole project with operations and maintenance in regards to that. The field that's located in the pit is really not an effective place to practice for varsity or JV. We have run football practices down there, which are limited because of the way the field goes. If you ever walk that field, you'll know what we mean. So when we talk about how many fields are available on campus, we have our main two fields, which we have lights on one. So it allows us to do more than one team within that group. And we will have access to the middle school field, which we will have to be pushing varsity teams down to depending on game days, right? So depending on what happens on a game day, when we can fit practices in, it could be moving different teams to different places because they won't be able to piggyback the way they normally do depending on the start time of the game. When it comes to what else we have access to, we have potential access to Meadow Pond. We have access to, with the town like we normally do over at Fox Valley, but we are now moving kids off campus. So the goal was to keep as many kids on campus as possible. So
I did mention to Chris also, because we're really trying to get the younger kids outside, a field like Meadow Pond wouldn't be available until about 3:45. And when it does start getting dark, that's going to make it not as desirable. And then also the transportation of needing, let's say, 2 buses to get a team somewhere instead of 1 is a further complication during that dismissal hour.
But in the name of equity, doesn't that apply equally to all student athletes? And we should not be penalizing our JV athletes in favor of our varsity athletes. I mean, how are we, just in general, I feel like there's a gap in information, for me anyway, and I did miss the last meeting, although I watched it. I was not present, so maybe there were some things that were clarified there that I didn't pick up on.
But Rory, I mean, I think they've said that if we add JV, it requires more transportation because we have to, so the costs are going to go up exponentially. It potentially exposes our kids to more schools, and it mixes more cohorts together. I mean, I think, I don't know, I'm hearing a lot of, I mean, I'm wondering whether we should be doing any sports based on all of what I'm hearing.
I think maybe if we do.
I mean, why don't we finish and then we can discuss. Sorry, yeah.
Because Rory, you have picked up appropriately on the supervision issue. So before we move on to the next slide, and Christian's pointed this out, on this slide you see that we've gone from, in most cases, we've increased by 1 coach. That 1 coach is the person who otherwise would be taking the JV team entirely by him or herself. So where we've got at least 2 coaches supervising varsity teams, we typically only have 1 supervising the JV team. And whether you buy into the cohort structure or not of the teaming, with all of the protocols necessary and to enforce, we hope, mask wearing and hydration breaks and all those other things, we don't think having 1 person supervising a team of 20 or more students is a very responsible thing to do. So we show that, we break down some of the costs here on the next slide. And you can see here, these are the positions that the board approved last week, with the varsity coaches here at the top, the assistant varsity coaches that we moved up who otherwise would have been doing JV. The site coordinator positions are always there, and that gets you to the total. In order to think about JV, our thinking would be you need the same varsity coaches Now these JV coaches are back at their regular JV position, so the stipend changes a little bit. And then we would be thinking we would at least want additional JV assistant type coaches to do some more supervision. So you see an additional increase in costs down there. And that's just for the stipends for the coaches. There would be other additional costs too. So if we keep moving forward, Christian has spoken to this a little bit. And Christian, if you want to weigh in more on this, that's fine with me. But I'll speak to it briefly. In a typical year, when we have a contest, just 1 or 2 chaperones can take care of the supervision for us, because as many fans as want to come in are allowed. They don't need to be closely supervised. Generally, they have some supervision. But this year, we're talking about health screeners, potentially, not only for the athletes, but potentially if we get to a point where there are fans, it's not clear if there would be yet, but checking temperatures, monitoring attendance at each entrance, enforcing all the protocols. It's very clear to us that additional chaperones are going to be necessary for the varsity games. And then if there are JV games, it would be the same thing there also. We would need additional chaperones. Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that we have to cover each entrance, because they're only allowed to, if we have, so it brings us to the spectator piece.
Yep.
Right now, we don't know if spectators are going to be permitted. The section is going to look to take hopefully a regional stand on that. But currently, the way we're set up, the Department of Health allows for 2 people per athlete. So we would have to do a screening on those people before they come in and a temperature check. So you'd have a staff that would be working that. We have to cover every possible entrance to a facility. So if you're looking at our stadium, we have 4 areas where people could come in. So even if we were at a JV game, which we normally would have maybe 1 chaperone, you're starting off with 4 plus your screening team, and then plus people moving around and monitoring that social distancing is taking place and that we're in compliance. If you take then you move to an area like tennis, which is normally really a walk-through supervision sport, you're now manning 2 entrances from there, having to do screenings, which is something that hasn't ever happened in the past. And that would be consistent with any facility we use. We'd have to follow those same type protocols. We then have to look at what our options are across the street, because we don't have hand washing stations at AP Farm because of the type of bathrooms that we have set up. There are waterless bathrooms. So we'd have to manage and know that that could be managed safely. And right now I know that that's one of the reasons that facility would be one of the last to open to outside groups for that reason. But we're working with Paul Christensen on that, and he will provide the direction when it comes to running contests there, and if it's an issue and what can be done to make it the most manageable space that we're in compliance. So I think that's the big challenge, is it changes the landscape of every level, and exponentially the need for a number of people there in order to follow the guidelines that are put in place.
If the guidelines are such that we're permitted to have spectators, do we necessarily need to have spectators? It doesn't seem to me that spectatorship is mandatory for a contest.
No, it's not mandatory. One of the things that's out there now is the potential to start with no spectators and then maybe graduate to home fans only. So we wouldn't have outside fans coming in that we'd have to monitor and work through. But the section has not taken a stand on that. That's something that's still coming out. And then we as a school district would then have the ability to then make our own decision when it comes to that. So that's really a question mark for us right now. We are pushing and moving forward with Local Live, which will enable us to use the stadium as a place where we can have all of those contests live streamed. And we'll work that as a way for our families to have access to the game, all the home games at least.
Okay, so these additional cost considerations are optional.
Rory, I would say to some degree they may be. You know, even with no fans, we would have to have some supervision there, in part to make sure the fans weren't.
The only thing that becomes, well, I mean, the reality is you still have to have the security piece. You wouldn't have as many screeners in place, and you wouldn't have the roving chaperones, but you would have to put people at each of the entrances so that people couldn't enter. That's all. So you would still have a JV game would still have a minimum of 4 people working the entrance points, the access points.
I think we have just a couple more slides to get through, and then we're open to all conversation. And I think we've covered some of these things already. We've talked about the need for off-campus field or court space for JV sports to happen and the transportation challenges, as well as the mixing of the cohorts and the need for students to get here and the challenge for students potentially to get here on days when they're not in school. Chris, you want to speak to this one other piece that comes from the
Sure.
state?
So normally, so the 7-day rule that New York State Public puts in place does not permit teams during the regular season to participate in 7 consecutive days of games or practices or contests, so that every 7th day must be a day off. What they are doing, because of what's happened, is in an effort to get more possible game days in and practice days in for student athletes, is that as of October 12th, which will be after the 10 practice requirement is completed, they are waiving the 7-day rule, which means practices could be 7 days, games could be 7 days a week, in an effort that now Sunday becomes a day that could be utilized for one or both, in order to help spread out student athletes and get in as many competitions as possible.
Thanks, Chris. And I'm sure actually this list is probably much longer than what's on the slide, but at the very least, you know, we're not exactly sure what will happen among schools if schools take different approaches and then they end up playing each other, how that will be handled. And we know there are still questions about the seasons to come, but all those questions are still wide open. And we'll just have to wait and see. The guidance we've had so far is specific to this fall season.
Andrew, another good point to kind of give is when you look at the winter season was slated to begin by NYSPHSAA on November 30th, which was a change in that date, but the governor's office and the health department has not relieved the ability for high-risk sports to begin participating. They're supposed to make a decision on that prior to December 31st. So high-risk sports of hockey, boys and girls basketball, wrestling, you know, we are set to start in theory on the 30th, but the governor's office has said that they may not give us a ruling on when they can start until at the latest, the 31st of December. So you're seeing the way it could play out again as we move to the winter.
Thank you, Chris. Before we just go back into questions, and I'm sure there are many out there, I do want to go back a little bit to where we started and just say a couple other things. So, you know, as I said at the beginning, there are all kinds of perspectives on this issue, and I think we've heard some of the range of perspectives even tonight, from not thinking that sports are a good idea at all, to wondering why aren't we doing both varsity and JV. I'm sure there would be other perspectives out there where even though Section 1 has canceled modified, would want to know, why can't we also do modified? And we're really not here to say which we think is the best thing to do. We would love, honestly, in a more typical time, we would want all of our students playing sports, and we would be thinking about ways to include all of them. You know, what we're trying to do is to find a way to do something as safely as possible and to accommodate what we think is interest out there, and to do it as safely as we can. We can't be certain about what's the best thing to do. We're not getting that kind of certainty in the guidance that we're being given. We're being given some guidelines, some parameters to operate within, but we're not being mandated. I think it's worth noting there are some entire sections around the state, I think there's about 4 of them, maybe 5, that have decided not to continue with fall sports at all. Section 1 isn't one of those. And I think it's fair to say, Christian, you'll correct me, but I think the majority of sections are moving forward, but a number.
The Long Island is not at all. Both sections
Right.
are not, and Section 9 as well.
Okay.
And I think Section 2 maybe.
Maybe. So, but more than half of the sections are continuing. Section 1 is one of them. And within Section 1, there are a couple of school districts, at least, that have decided themselves not to move forward. Yonkers is one. I think Pauling is another. Right. But the vast majority, it does seem, at the moment, are moving forward. We know of, I think, at least one other district that's thinking similarly to us around just varsity, but it is true that most seem to be moving forward with both varsity and JV. I don't think it's our place to try to understand all of their thinking or their decision making. You know, I'm sure they're all making the decisions that they believe are best for their districts. We would want to do the same thing. We're not here tonight to tell you what the best decision is. We're here to share with you our thinking around why we reached a decision that we thought was reasonable, and we're absolutely open now to hearing from you and thinking about it with you, and thinking and coming to the best decision we can collectively.
I just want to throw into the mix, I
Yep.
don't envy any of you who are in sort of decision-making seat, because I think it is really complicated, and I understand why we want opportunities for all of our kids. I guess I just wanted to add, though, before we begin, I can't think of a time in the 31 years I've been in the district that an athletic director has not welcomed someone saying, here, have some additional staff. So I want us really listening to that. And the other part, and I don't mean this to be preachy or to criticize at another time, when we added FLES that year, while it was a great and wonderful thing that the board wanted us to do, the administration basically had said we weren't ready. And then for years after, we heard about how it didn't go well. And I think partly it didn't go well because we weren't ready. So I think we have to at least weigh in that we're getting some guidance from Chris that says, let's start with this and maybe we can add in other seasons. And I am personally anxious that if we decide to move forward and we maybe push harder than the athletic director is telling us we're ready, we may regret it. And there are 2 other seasons. And while I would love to let all of our younger athletes play, I have to make some assumptions that in addition to numbers, part of the decision is that this may be the last opportunity for some of our student athletes who are the older students, and other students hopefully will have time in future years. But again, I know it's way more complicated than that. And of course, we'll respect wherever the board lands in the end.
Thanks, Alice.
Thank you all. I do think that to focus on the positive at the outset, one of the things that is making this very challenging is that for several years in a row now, we have been in the terrific position of expanding opportunity for kids after school, and specifically expanding athletic opportunity. And honestly, I think the community really has appreciated that. And at this time when everybody is so limited in terms of, you know, how can we create opportunities for kids to safely be together in school or outside of school? You know, it's really hard to think about being in a position where we're only able to provide opportunity to so many fewer students than we have in recent past years, and to be moving in what feels like a very different direction, obviously with health and safety front and center in our minds. So for very good reason. Another thing that, as has been noted already, but I think it's worth reiterating, is making this very hard, is that so many districts in our section have made the decision to move forward, not only with fall sports, but with varsity and JV. And with respect to the conversation around resources, you know, it's hard not to want to ask about infrastructure comparisons. You know, well, how is every other district managing resource allocation with their fields and with their coaches? So it's hard to not let your mind go to, how are so many other districts arriving at this other place where they perhaps didn't stop to consider running the varsity without JV. And finally, I guess what I would say is that at the very beginning of our meeting tonight, Andrew, you made the comment that our staff is working so hard to recreate school. And it's very confusing to me, and this is not with regard to KLSD, it's more with regard to the New York State Public School Athletic Association. This doesn't feel to me like working hard to recreate sports. I do respect so much of what has been pointed out with regard to things being different, whether it's spectators or mask wearing. But at the end of the day, the notion that interscholastic sports should continue, and we should introduce our students to not only other cohorts within Katona Lewisboro, but counterparts in other districts. It's just very confusing to me. It feels like, it really does feel like cross purposes with the mindset that we had to bring to bear on how to provide education to kids. And partly that might be because the sports are outside, and so there are differences, but it's hard not to see some of this as like being asked to just do things the way we did do things pre-pandemic, which isn't to say I don't hear what you're saying about spacing out our resources and our students and our staff and keeping kids further apart and things of that nature. But somehow it doesn't feel quite the same as the spirit we brought to opening schools, which was to say, like, we need to educate every child and we got to figure out how to do that. And so here I can't figure out why there wasn't an impetus to say we need to figure out how to provide athletic opportunity to as many kids as we can, and we just might not be able to do it in the same interscholastic sport manner that we've been accustomed to doing it in the past. That's just, it's just another piece of context that I am struggling with. So in that case, I want to open the floor to everybody. I'm at your mercy. I really need to hear from everybody because this is really hard. And certainly having appointed coaches just 2 weeks ago, it's hard to pull that back and to then say.
That's really not an issue. I just want to say the coaches are aware that we needed to do that so that we'd be ready.
No, I appreciate that. Let me clarify, please, because
Okay.
I mean for our kids. I mean for our kids.
Okay.
We've now got, from the count I saw, we've got 120, 130 students, those who make the teams.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
I'm just thinking about those kids. So we've got that. Yeah. Please go ahead, Liz. Yes.
Thank you, Chris and Andrew, for putting this together and giving us such a thoughtful overview of what's going on. This is one of those really horrible situations where we can only be certain we made the right decision if we were wrong. And I can't help but think that going around to other schools to have competitions isn't something that they use like in a textbook contagion video that you would see on YouTube. I mean, it seems to me the exact wrong thing to do. And then, we've got the guidance from the New York Department of Health, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. They made the choices on sports, what should be played and what shouldn't. And then, we potentially can't mandate masks. It does call into question the, kind of the whole way that they looked at this for me. Because those, we can pick out a few things really easily that don't seem to make sense. And then, just given the time of year, we're headed into, flu season. It's about to get colder. Everyone's going to be inside more. And, we're seeing upticks all over Europe right now, where they're looking at second waves of the pandemic. And then third, we spoke about board goals tonight, and we talked about fiscal responsibility. And I'm not sure this meets the test. You've got the benefit of running this program that is concentrated among, say, 125 students, but ultimately the risk is going to be spread across the entire community. And I wonder, this doesn't seem like an equitable use of the school's resources. So I love sports, I do. And it pains me to think that so many kids would miss the opportunity to do something that is so important to them and plays a big role in their mental well-being, in their social lives. But at the end of the day, I just come to the conclusion that until we can have students safely in school 5 days a week, doing all of this for extracurriculars seems counter to what should be our core mission at this point, given the situation we're in. That's all I got.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure, sir.
Just about the whole idea of community spread because of these sports. Would it be possible to mandate that students who are participating in athletics learn remotely while they are competing and participating, so as to not then contract the virus and then come to school the following day or the following week and unknowingly transmit it to their classmates? Just because I think that could be kind of dangerous. And I know I'm not really invested in any sport right now, so I wouldn't really be willing to lose my in-school education for an athletic season that might not even be satisfactory for many students as is, because of the kind of state of what's going on. So I was just wondering, would that be possible, or would that not be equitable? Because as we talk about equity.
Such an interesting idea, Sawyer, but I think there would be a discrimination factor that because a student elected one thing, they were forced into another situation in terms of their education. But it is an interesting
question. I think, possibly on a voluntary basis. And I'm not even sure that that's accurate in my answer, Sawyer, but I don't think we could enforce it.
Going back to the slide that showed how many students would be on the rosters, and you don't have to go back to it now, but there was an earlier slide that indicated that for safety reasons, it would be at least a consideration, if not just a practice going into the season, that we would limit the number of students who travel to contests. So can you put a little more color on that? How many students are we talking about of the 20 to 24 on a varsity team? How many are traveling for soccer, let's say, and then for tennis, for cross country?
So we haven't really made final determinations because it depends on how the tryouts and things play out and how large the rosters actually are. But if you found yourselves with a maxed out roster of say 24 to 26, you'd probably only travel with about 18 for a soccer game. And then you might be rotating the other group, or because of the makeup of the team, there may be kids that are more practice or more geared towards practice because they wouldn't have made that the roster in a normal year. They would have played on JV, but because of where they were in the pecking order, they were able to earn a spot on that team, so they can continue to be at practice. So a lot of that really still has to be determined, and that number could be adjusted because you might find situations where, athletes 17, 18, and 19 are pretty similar. And so they kind of bring it, and so it would make sense to take one over the other because of what they bring to the table. So there will be some flex in that. Generally, you probably look at 14, I think is the number that can compete as long as the other tennis team has a full number of student athletes, but I can be sure about that. That's usually what you're getting in. But what happens now, the light will be an issue with that. So we might have to limit that more. Like I said, we might at John Jay have to split an actual match into 2 sites so that we can get 10 courts playing as we get further along with daylight savings running out. So it could look a little different. It's really hard to give you a real clear picture.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Not to travel with a full roster.
Mm-hmm. And has there been any discussion in light of the fact that it's been determined that all practices will be looked at like a Saturday practice, and therefore students would be required to provide their own transportation to practice? Has there been any discussion of requiring students to travel on their own to contests, eliminating the need for any transportation costs at all?
No, we're still required to provide transportation by the state outside of our boundary lines. So we do have scenarios where if we had a game at Fox Valley, students who have the ability to drive can take themselves to practice or games that are taking place there. But the minute we go outside of our borders, they'd be traveling together. We do have special circumstances where a parent might be bringing a child from a field trip or an appointment. They couldn't make the bus and they drive them directly there, but students can never take themselves directly to an event. So it's the same rate if you're traveling to a game. Part of the experience and part of the preparation would take place on that bus with the coaches and getting ready to game plan or get in a mindset as you are on the way to a place that I think could be lost in that scenario.
I do understand that, but again, just trying to look at like all angles and what could be feasible and how to reduce costs if we're even going to move forward. And again, in that spirit of like, we just need to recreate this, you know?
We do have a policy to revisit if the board decides to run some sports, and then we would want to revisit that travel policy.
And it may not be worthwhile to even pursue this line of inquiry, but it does strike me as so inequitable that now students are required to get their own transportation to practice. You know, they don't even come to school on certain days, but a parent has to drive them. And I guess if we privilege varsity, then presumably some kids can drive themselves, but not all.
There are some other similar circumstances, like jazz band practices at night, and so the kids have to have their own transportation to come back. So it's not exclusive to athletics.
That's helpful. Is there any appetite within the section? And it's hard to even say this. I mean, we said two neighboring districts are experiencing positive cases of COVID. I think they were Somers and Bedford, but they're the districts that come to mind. You know, any appetite to create, I heard what you said, that within section 1, we're not allowed to do our own thing, but, you know, if we call it varsity with an asterisk, can we just compete against some very, very regional teams and then require kids to have their own transportation because we're within that geographic radius, and run not just a shorter season from a timeline perspective, but from a geographic radius perspective?
So we're focused on our league schedule. Now our league schedule is a little different. Our base league actually is, we're with Horace Greeley, we're with Byram Hills, but we're also with Ardsley and Edgemont in that same league. So we do get stretched away from the league we were previously in with Somers and Yorktown. We are playing them locally as well. So we play our league schedule, and then we play our local schedule, which will be schools like Somers and Yorktown and maybe Lakeland Panis, schools like that. It does change slightly depending on the sport, because we're aligned a little bit differently in leagues when it comes to that because of the number of teams that participate. But we don't have a lot of movement other than we could say we're going to do our own thing. But the minute we do that, we can't compete in any end of season competition. So if I change if I pull myself out of my league and run an independent schedule, then I could try to pick up games. But when sectionals came around, we wouldn't be permitted to play. Our season would end and every other school would take part in the tournament. So it's probably not the best case scenario. And I don't know, and Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, that we have the ability to allow students to drive based on New York State guidance outside of our boundaries.
We'd have to look at that, Chris. As Alice pointed out, we have a local policy on that. So certainly the local policy would have to change. I don't know beyond that policy whether there are state laws that govern it. We could resolve that fairly quickly, I would think, to know what's true.
Yeah, please go ahead. Someone else. Yeah.
I have a couple things. I think what I'm struggling with is on any given school day, on a Monday or Tuesday or a Thursday or Friday, we have 1,500 kids at home who are at home. Their families are trying to figure out how to support them and manage them because we're doing everything we can to keep our kids in school as much as possible for as long as possible. And this, while it just seems like we're privileging this one group to behave totally differently, to come to school on a day that's not their cohort day, to interact with one another potentially without masks in closer distance than they would in a more, heavy breathing way than they would in a classroom or in a cafeteria or on a playground. And then there are kids who are going to be home, who need to get to school so that they can be a part, if we have sports, to be a part of a team. They have to figure out how to get there and feel that pressure amidst all the other pressures of the pandemic that we are in. We are in a pandemic. It has not ended. And I'm really struggling with, as we talk through all these different things, I just think, I realize we would be outliers, and I don't, that might be really hard on us as individual board members to walk around in town knowing that we've maybe done something that's really upset these 125 or 150 families. But I just feel like we have 800 other families to consider, or how many other families to consider. And I'm really struggling with what the right thing to do is, but there's a part of me that feels like this just seems, as Liz said, at cross purposes with all the other, the unbelievable work of our administrators and our custodial staff and our teachers and all the planning that went into the cohort making and the 2 days a week. It just seems like we're just completely disregarding that. And so I guess I would really like to hear from Christian your perspective on how, or maybe other parents, how they would feel if we just said, we're just not going to have contests. We're going to have sports. You can practice. You can have the camaraderie of being a part of a team on the days that you're in school. You can practice with kids who are in those days in your cohort, and you can develop skills that way. And maybe Monday, Tuesday is 17 kids and Thursday, Friday is 6. And that's kind of weird, but you could still exercise and improve your skills with 6 people. And just say, we don't want to go to Edgemont and we don't want to go to Chappaqua, and say, we're going to have sports. We're just not going to have contests this year. And I would feel much, much better about that than what we're proposing right now.
Julia, before Christian answers that, can I ask for a point of clarification? So are you saying that you're concerned about the whole sports operation, varsity and potentially JV, or are you only concerned about the addition of the complexity of adding JV?
No. I'm saying the whole contest, varsity athletics, even if it's only varsity, involved in contests with other districts, involved in practicing across cohorts, involved in kids trying to get here on days that they don't have school. All of those things to me seem to be at cross purposes with creating an environment for kids to get to school as much as possible for as long as possible in our district. And so I'm saying the whole thing. I actually really understand. To me, the choice to only have varsity actually makes sense. So I'm really not questioning that. I understand from the equity perspective, people's concern about it, but I do understand the minimizing the numbers. It's reducing the numbers somewhat. It's reducing the amount of interaction we have with other districts. If we agree to have sports at all, I would support only having varsity sports. But I'm just not clear that we should be having contests. I like the idea of practice. I like the idea of kids getting outside after school and exercising and being together and getting coached. I don't like the idea of mixing the two-day cohorts within our own district. And I really don't like the idea of us traveling to other districts.
If I can just add to what Julia is saying quickly, Christian, I'm sorry, I want you to be able to respond, but I do feel the need to just underscore that I just reached for my calendar a few minutes to go to see, like, where would we be 10 days out from the 29th when, I don't know if that's when the first practice starts. I guess you have to field your teams first, and then there's a day and you count 10 days from there. But I feel the same way about those 10 days as I felt about the possibility of bringing students back to school in person, which is to say, I remember thinking, even if we're only able to do it for 2 weeks, even if we're only able to do it till the end of September, it will be so meaningful for kids to meet their teachers in person, to feel as if they got to go back to their schools, to their buildings, to their classrooms, some to ride the bus. And similarly here, I do feel like this idea of 10 days of practice for our students, and the more the better in my imagination, that feels like this golden opportunity. And I wish we could agree that if you come to school on day A, that's when you practice. And if you come to school on day B, that's when you practice. And we can call it varsity and JV and whatever we call it. But to me, that's like where I can go in terms of visualizing this and thinking this is fine. And then after that, I kind of assume things are going to shut down anyway, because it does seem unlikely that they won't shut down. But if they don't, that is where I then feel like, how can we then put our kids on buses to go have these contests possibly without masks and everything you just described, and the fact that there's this much uncertainty on the 24th when this is all supposed to begin on the 29th. that just does not inspire confidence. So I'm sorry, I'm digressing, but I wanted to just underscore this point that practicing feels great. Exercise for kids feels great. In my ideal world, it would be consistent with our cohorts and we would not be competing against other students. All of that makes a lot more sense to me than what we would otherwise be proposing to do. And again, from my perspective, the more kids, the better for whom we can do that safely.
So Marjorie, I could actually weigh in from a personal perspective because I live in Pauling. So I have a junior son who was the quarterback of the football team and plays in the, one of the shooting guard for the basketball team. He's not participating in sports this year. And I can tell you it was very, very difficult. They are running exactly what you're saying, a cohort-based workouts afterwards, which I can tell you the kids will not be enthusiastic about because I'm experiencing it as a parent, and not because it really becomes intramurals. The kids, in reality, because you're training within your school, you're doing different things, you're competing, your skills and drills, you'd be probably pretty surprised at where the lack of enthusiasm would come in from a student athlete's perspective. And I get to see it at home every day. So I've really lived this at home because last year my daughter was a senior lacrosse player. So she lost that year. My son lost his baseball season. So it has hit home. And that's why when we went through this process, knowing all the things you're saying are so true, the uncertainty, we don't know how this is going to play out. I would tell you I'd feel so much more comfortable if they said the mask requirement that we're looking to put in place would be okay, and if that got approved. But I would say that the practice only model will probably be a pretty unsuccessful one. And I would tell you that any students that are doing that would maybe do that for a little bit and then shoot out and look to play somewhere else in order to try to participate in something. So when we look at this perspective is when we came forth with the recommendation of varsity only, it was for all these reasons that yes, other schools are looking to run JV programs, but I can tell you many of them are terrified of the fact that they're trying to accomplish both at the same time. But they're going for it, and they all have their own reasons, and we respect that. Our thought process behind this was try to make this experience the best it can be, knowing there's going to be intermittent stoppages and trying to limit the number of teams that could potentially close our buildings for a day, for a couple of days, depending on what we're looking at. And that's why the focus was put and say, let's give it a shot. Let's try to give something to our upperclassmen because their clock is ticking, where my younger students, their clock can be prolonged over the next couple of years. And that sense of loss and the social emotional sense of loss, I think that our upperclassmen will have with another loss of season that we didn't give it a try, I think will be devastating to them. And that's a lot of the feedback we are getting. Kids are really struggling. They struggled immensely with the spring. That came directly from our coaches and them working directly with kids. And I think this would be a devastating blow to our upperclassmen to lose 2 consecutive seasons. And so the thought process, although it's certainly not perfect in many, many ways, was to provide the additional supervision to try and maintain the healthiest environment we can. We have the ability, we're regulated. These other organizations outside us are not. And so when we look at that from that perspective, we can, by limiting our movements or by limiting our numbers, we are limiting the potential for transmission. We're not removing it by any sense of the imagination. But I do think it would be absolutely devastating to our student athletes to lose another season. And I would hope that we would at least put the necessary piece in place to at least give it a chance and that the model that we had recommended, and it's strictly, I want my JV athletes to play sports. I want my modified athletes to play sports. I've been doing this for a really long time. But when push comes to shove and you're in a hybrid environment with your school and the schools around you, you have to make really difficult decisions. And you don't know that they're the right ones. You're hoping that you're making the best case scenarios out of what's in front of you. So as much as I would say, I'd fight for our JV kids to participate, if it's going to put the whole operation at risk, I have to be mindful that my upperclassmen clock is ticking for eligibility. And whatever they lose, we cannot give back to them. You know, so if they lose a fall season, that's the last fall season they'll ever have. And so the hope would be by modifying our offerings, we would at least limit, not remove, obviously, the potential for one of our athletic programs to be the reason we could be closed down for a day, a week, or who knows what the situation is. So I felt this on a personal level, and I live it obviously here in trying to do what we're hoping is best, considering all the circumstances that come into play.
Can I say something? I also think I would like to see us play sports in whatever capacity that is. And I'd love to see the jazz band still play, and I'd love to see our extracurricular activities continue. Because while I know that the education and getting our children back in school was the most important thing, I think we have to be mindful of the mental health, which I think is also so extremely important to our students right now. Where I'm struggling as a board member is that while I understand the health of our students is the priority, we don't live in a bubble. And so in the community, I see so many sports taking place. Youth sports are taking place now everywhere. So I'm struggling, and I don't mean to be disrespectful. I don't know how much I should say here, but I feel like we're really not necessarily living in a cohort and in a bubble. So, you know, they are coming on their A day or their B day, but there's more than hundreds of kids who are playing sports every weekend and then mixing with cohorts. I would like to see the competition. I agree with Christian, although I do have a daughter who was a Division I athlete, and it was devastating for her to lose her season this year. She is now currently playing sports. They play every day, and they're in pods, and they're on Monday that she'll start practicing with her entire team. She is not competing. She is thrilled to be with her team and practicing. So I disagree a little bit with Christian just because I'm living it also as well personally. But I do recognize that the competition plays a big part in our student athletes. I'd love to try it. My opinion, I don't know if it's right or wrong. I don't think we have any of the answers. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Terrence.
I'm having one of those out-of-body experiences where I feel like I am so out of step with everybody else. And I keep thinking to myself, I must be wrong then, as unusual as that would be, right? This is life and death. People die from this disease. The kids bring it home to the grandparents, to the uncles, to the sisters, to the parents. This is a contagious, deadly disease. And we've gone through, we have them promise that you haven't traveled to Florida 10 days ago. And if you do, please stay home, because there's a finite small risk you pose. But this whole operation is acting as if we can somehow take time off and not be as vigilant because we're doing sports. I am surprised that this is that this isn't perceived differently by more people. That this is, you know, you can try it, but you're rolling the dice when you try things like this. And, you know, it just strikes to me as putting all of your work at risk, all of the work that we've been thanking you for weeks, and you've been thanking people for weeks, is putting that at risk. And you're putting people's lives at risk. And if people make other bad decisions, and we've been saying for weeks on board meetings, please, 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 to the community, do the right thing. You're doing it for all of us, you know, really think things through, blah, 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 blah. And then we do this. I don't get it. I don't get it.
Terrence, yeah.
So, I mean, Okay, I'm listening and I'm processing, and so I'm going to ramble a little bit, but I'll say I agree. I don't think we live in a bubble. Cohorting is a smart, strategic approach, and I think that's been, it's happening everywhere, or in many places, I should say. But I agree. This is about calculated strategic risk, and cohorting helps to kind of bring some sense or logic to how we approach that risk. I got to say, I want to make sure we say out loud, or at least I say out loud, Christian and Andrew deserve a lot of credit for wrestling with this, because this isn't, along with everything else that they and the whole administration have been dealing with for over 6 months now. There's no right answer. It's completely thankless, and they're trying to make the best of a really kind of, just such a hard situation, right? So, you all deserve a lot of credit for just even getting us to this point. I do have to say, look, for me, as much as it kind of pains me personally to get 468 emails from the district every single, day or two, I do read them. I do try to read them. So I've been aware of what the district has been thinking of doing for athletics for a while now. And in my own kind of calculus, I've been able to make sense of how the district has approached it. I do feel like we're coming to our concerns or opposition to some of this a little late, right? Like it's September 24th, and we're supposed to start doing things on September 29th. And, I don't know, can we really turn this car around at this point? I don't know. And I'm also not sure that would be fair, right? Because again, just speaking for myself, I've been aware of what Christian, Andrew, and the athletics program have been kind of thinking. So, varsity only might be the best and only realistic option. Just again, there's a lot of detail. I'm not going to pretend like I understand all those pieces. A lot of it's driven by emotion. Clearly, what we're talking about, what families are talking about. And I agree. Like, I hope that we have a similar, very pensive conversation about the clubs and activities, because I think those are equally valuable to the students who are not on the playing fields or on the courts. Ultimately, again, this is going to be very broad and sound very bureaucratic, but, I don't know, is there a way to use more concrete data to help drive these decisions? If, let's say, the varsity decision is out the gate and the next decision is about junior varsity, how much data can we use? Because I definitely agree with Bill. This is a health and safety concern. That has to be paramount. You all are taking a lot more risk right now by even being in the building. I'm in my pink office because it's not a risk that I'm frankly willing to take. And I've said it before, as long as the governor's executive order allows me to do these kinds of meetings from, not being in person, I'm going to take advantage of that. That is my own calculated risk. I'll also say my girls are playing softball, right? And I watch half the girls wear masks sometimes and half the girls don't. And again, that is a calculated risk that we are, as a family, have discussed and made a decision about. So, I don't know if that's helpful. I don't know if there's a right answer to any of that, but, if there's a way to do a kind of cost benefit analysis that brings in money, but that also brings in the number of students that are ultimately affected, I think it's incumbent on us to make a decision that, we have to have the courage to make that hard decision about how do we benefit the most, number of students and the highest number of families, without putting them at unnecessary risk, right? And that, to me, might come back to letting those varsity students have as much of a season as possible, but not putting those younger students at risk, and trusting that Christian and Andrew are watching all the details, and that y'all are going to be ready to pull the plug. Once you start seeing some crazy, silly things out there, that we have to then really just pull the plug. My own university that I work for, they made the decision early on to just cancel football. They just weren't going to play football. There was no modification to what they were going to do or how they were going to do it. Now, granted, I'm not talking about Auburn or Alabama, right? But still, it was a kind of a big deal because there's a lot of money involved. So I think, we just have to use data and try to make the best decision that we can.
I appreciate your point. I do want to just clarify with respect to timeline and to try to reframe what I'm hearing as some impatience and inappropriateness associated with asking these questions tonight, that the board learned of the plan 2 Wednesdays ago. So yesterday, 2 weeks ago. And immediately after that board meeting, that weekend, we did learn, in addition, that, and Kristen alluded to this in his remarks just moments ago, many of the students who won't be able to play JV sports will be participating in other programs not administered by KLSD, or at least those opportunities will exist, and we can't be held responsible for individual families' choices. But I do want to clarify that, being confronted with the reality that in a pandemic moment, KLSD would be offering opportunities differently than it had in the past, and not offering certain opportunities where families have, quite frankly, come to expect those opportunities. Learning that new information, coupled with the reality that this week is the week that many of our neighboring districts are appointing coaches to field JV rosters and varsity rosters, from my own perspective, those two inputs were sufficient to cause me to feel a responsibility to seek clarification regarding how we arrived at this decision and whether we're certain that this is the way we would want to move forward if we are going to participate in Section 1's fall season.
And Marjorie, one important part to realize is part of the reason that the plan came to you when it did is literally because Andrew and I, along with the rest of the section and state, were in limbo waiting for governance to come down, not only from the state as it did, but then it moved to, we didn't get our governance from New York State Public High School Athletic Association until over a week or 2 weeks after that. And then it goes to the section level. So the reality of our plan and the plans of districts all over the section was we were all in this holding pattern waiting for this information to provide clarity, which in some cases never came, and in other cases came quite late.
I appreciate you saying that. And I really appreciate that, Christian. And I want to clarify that by stating the timeline, that is not, it is not my intention to criticize the timeline. In fact, what we're experiencing around this decision is very similar to something we've experienced around other decisions we've had to make throughout the pandemic, which is to say, things seem to happen very, very slowly. Nothing's happening at all. And then all of a sudden we have to make a decision. And in this case, 2 weeks ago, it was a very expensive decision to the tune of $80-some-odd thousand with a somewhat incomplete picture. And that is not anybody's fault. In fact, we're hearing tonight that the picture is still somewhat incomplete with regard to something very important, namely mask wearing and what the expectations are going to be. So really, it's not my intention to criticize. It was my intention to clarify that to the extent that there's any impatience or a sense of inappropriateness that we would question the plan tonight, I disagree with that. I think the timeline is what it is for many good reasons, but that we are responsible for all of the students in the district, and we're seeking to understand why it is that the recommendation was what it was. And again, to reiterate comments that have been made already, and we really appreciate the slides and the information and the additional insight into the decision making, and have more appreciation for just how difficult this has been for the duration of time that you've been trying to make the decision or come to the recommendation.
ESY was very similar, as you might remember. We weren't having ESY. That was a state level decision. Then you could have it, and then we were in the position of figuring out if we could do it, and this seems very similar.
Absolutely. I appreciate you saying that. That's a great example of another moment where we felt nothing happening and almost certainty that we would not be allowed to do something.
Right.
11th hour, truly the 11th hour, not only were we allowed, but we were highly motivated to try to provide that instruction for our students over the summer in person. And we did, and it was amazing that we were able to do what we did. And so it's a great reminder. I appreciate that. And it's a great analogy. It doesn't necessarily help us move forward with any decision making we're here to do tonight, but I do think that you've really helped us to understand where you were coming from, you, the global administration. So thank you. Julia, are you waiting to say something?
Yeah, I'm just curious, Andrew, if you've thought at all about how we would respond to inquiries from parents who don't have athletes about this decision. I'm just not clear, who say like, I'm doing everything I can to, I'm working from home, or I'm paying somebody to be at my house, et cetera, on the days that my kids are home. Like, I'm just not sure how I would respond to someone who does not have an athlete about why we've moved forward with this. And perhaps it's just the wellness, the really focus on wellness for athletes and how difficult it is for them to commit to something for such a long period of time over the course of their youth, and to be unable to further that in their varsity seasons of the fall, and that we are making a calculated risk that the importance of the well-being for our students makes this risk one that we're willing to take. And I don't know, like I think that's my concern, is like, do we have to announce something? I guess my question is, do we need to make others aware of that? Would that change whether people have their kids in school? I don't know.
It's a really interesting question, I think, and interesting in terms of how we communicate things. So, I mean, I'm even looking, for example, at how many people are watching this meeting tonight, and it's not a very large number compared to some other meetings we've had. And that might be that when we communicate about sports, we communicate to those families who are going to be participating. We don't typically think of it as, which of course in this case, we do need to think of it as a decision or that impacts everybody or potentially impacts everybody. So I couldn't even tell you right now how widely known the impending sports season is in our community. Even that would be an interesting thing to know, whether how much awareness there is, how much thought and concern. We did all those surveys over the summer to get feedback from families. And I have to admit, honestly, it didn't dawn on us that this would be something to survey the entire community on, maybe to survey those who would be participating in sports. So I don't have more of an answer than that. I do, although, sorry, but let me just quickly add, I mean, it is, the range of perspectives we've heard again tonight, including people wondering, how did all these other districts reach this decision so quickly to not just move varsity forward, but to move JV forward? These are all thoughtful communities around us that all care about their kids and somehow reached a decision not just to put varsity out there, but to put all these students out there. It seems, even that you have to sort of put a caveat on. There's an article in the paper today about another Westchester district excited to have their soccer team out on the field, but even the coach is saying, we're excited to be practicing or starting practice next week. None of us is really 100% sure that the season's going to move forward. So there's still that kind of hesitation around it.
We would have one more board meeting before any contests started, wouldn't we?
Contests begin, I believe, on October 10th. Is that right, Christian?
Yeah, so we do.
October 10th.
We do.
What have the signups been like? Do we have normal numbers, or are people holding back because they're not certain if they want their children to participate? Do we have any sense of that?
We're going to end up we potentially could end up with more kids in sports that we didn't normally have them because there's less sports being offered. But it'll still has to play out for the rest of the week to see how those numbers pan out. But it's climbing pretty steadily from that perspective. So it's not way off. It's just we have less sports that we're offering. but we don't know yet how many kids are going to look to migrate over from a sport like volleyball or football that's not being offered and participate in tennis, cross country, or the soccer or field hockey. So it's still a little early because we'll get a lot late registration just by just the way it normally goes.
Rory, are you waiting to say something?
Yeah. Thanks, Marjorie. I think my going-in position is that the risk of any sports is so high that we should be extraordinarily careful.
Rory, I think your headphones are not working. Sorry.
Hang on a second. Let's see if I do this.
Better. I think so.
I was just saying, I think the risk of doing any sports at all is extraordinarily high. I concur with most of the folks here that there is a risk, and it's clearly a counter to all of the strong work that we've been doing to try to minimize the risk for all the students in the school. Having said that, I think when it comes to sports, anybody in our town who's athletically minded is likely to participate in sports in some form or another, whether it's scholastic or it's club or it's hanging out with their pals down at Vista Park or whatever. I really don't think that by us not running a program, we're going to reduce the risk to the community because students are not going to be playing sports together. I think that they will be doing that regardless. Case in point, we already know that a pretty prominent club in town has sent out emails to people saying, hey, because there is no JV, we're going to offer a JV-like environment, send your kids over here. The problem with that approach, of course, is that we have no control over that. We don't know what sort of precautions those clubs are taking. We don't know with whom they're playing, where those other teams are coming from. So there's an inherent risk in saying no sports. And to me, there's also an inherent risk in saying no JV. I really do believe that in order to minimize the risk, we're actually probably better off running the interscholastic program, even though that sounds counterintuitive, and Bill is probably glaring at me from the back of the room. I do think it feels like it should be safer not to do so, but I actually think you're going to run the risk, and maybe even a bigger risk, if you pull everybody from sports. So I think the question is, do we do sports at all? And if the answer to that is yes, then I would really challenge, and that's the challenge that you heard from me earlier, why are we favoring the varsity kids? I hear Chris's point about people missing their last season and so on, but the social and emotional welfare of our JV kids is just as important. I don't think we can undermine how our JV kids feel about not having an opportunity to play. They certainly will go play at club level. There's also the question of why are we then putting the burden on our families to have to pay at the club level to go and have a similar experience that they otherwise would have expected from the school. So, one other point that crossed my mind is, we waited and waited for guidance, and we waited for guidance, but then when we received the guidance, we decided to be more restrictive than the guidance, which just doesn't sort of tally for me. And so I just feel like if we're going to do sports, we should do all sports, or we should do no sports, but we shouldn't be in some sort of half-hearted place where we're providing a benefit and a privilege to some students, but not to others. I don't see the equity in that. So that's where I'm at. I could get behind no interscholastic sports, but if we do interscholastic sports, then I really don't understand why we can't find a creative way to make JV work.
Any other comments or questions, clarifying questions? Not entirely sure how to summarize what we heard, to be honest. I think if I had to distill out where we landed, but maybe I shouldn't say it because I don't want to color the
Yeah,
will of the board, you know,
yeah.
I usually can hear a consensus. I'm less certain tonight that I heard a consensus. So maybe we want to go around and state our.
What's on the table exactly? What
Yeah.
is the vote we need to have, or?
You know, I don't know that we need any vote, Bill, and actually maybe that's a helpful question here. I think where we are is that we have a recommendation from the administration regarding how to run our sports program. And although certain things are in the purview of the board for sure, for example, we have the consent agenda on the table right now, and we're about to vote on a resolution to suspend our athletic placement process that enables younger students to move up and play from the middle school up into the high school. So we're doing that. We're going to vote on that. But with respect to any other voting, there really is no voting here. We voted at our last board meeting to approve coaching positions that would enable us to field varsity rosters. And in so doing, we appointed some extra coaches, some of whom might have been JV coaches in the past, but this year it's been proposed that they would support the varsity rosters for all of the reasons we heard tonight. So we got a little more insight into why we did that 2 weeks ago and how that's envisioned to support student athletes and keep them safer. So we've learned more about what we did and why we did it. And really we had a conversation tonight around many of the challenges associated with moving forward with this recommendation and some of the challenges associated with moving forward in either of two directions, which is to say, don't run sports at all. And that is something that's in the purview of the board, which is to say, we don't want to participate in this fall season. My understanding is that it would be in the board's purview to say, hearing everything we've said, I want to make a motion. Somebody would need to make a motion to say, we should sit out fall sports in section 1. And I think we could vote on that. Beyond that, you know, we've had conversation around whether we want to ask the administration to go back and develop different plans that arguably are in the purview of the administration. This is the administration's plan for how to roll out fall sports. And we've talked at length about that plan and how we arrived here. So I think at this point, you know, we do have the consent agenda on the table and we can vote on that. And then separate from that, and Kim can tell me if she sees it differently, please, or anybody, I think we would be, you know, waiting for a board member to make a resolution to say, I don't think we should participate in this season. You know, I'm not really sure.
Everybody knows how I feel. I don't want to be theatrical about this. I mean, I think I'm not sure if I've heard some support somewhere along the way of where I'm going, but not, I don't think, 4 full votes. So I don't want to be theatrical about this. And I certainly appreciate all the work that's gone into this. I hope that's not, you know, my position is not misconstrued that my position is any way denigrating the amount of work and effort and sincere belief that goes into this. Absolutely. I just feel like I don't want to force a vote on something that's just going to be put people in an uncomfortable position. If there's, you know, lots of other people who agree with me, then maybe we should pursue it. But I don't want to do it just to, you know, to make a point or to make people take a position. You know, that's I've more than expressed my opinion, and I guess that's where it is.
I understand what you're saying, Bill.
If I could just
and I'm running out of power, so if I disappear, that's why. Sorry.
But just to support Bill here, I mean, Bill is a doctor, and I think that we're very fortunate to have him on board at this time
when we have all of these challenges. And
I keep coming back to, Bill, that first do no harm, right? That's Hippocratic oath, something along those lines. Bill says,
I hear what you're saying.
I mean, I'm kind of looking at this as maybe we should say first do no harm. I mean, why would we take any risk that we don't absolutely have to? I'm with
you. Yeah. But I think it's also really a good time to remind people that you are a medical doctor And, you know, I think we're lucky to have you, and I really think that your counsel is considered and important to listen to.
I appreciate that, but I go to some pains to not. I have seen things day in, day out that other people haven't seen, so maybe that influences my opinion, but my opinion is as a board member and not out of any special medical expertise. I fall on the side of science and biology, but this isn't, I don't think my opinion should carry any more weight than anybody else's.
Well, I do support what you're saying, and I come to the conclusion as well that I just don't see a way that we do this if we're still not able to have students in school 5 days, and it imperils all of the other work that we're doing for education.
So maybe we how do others feel? Do others feel similarly to this? Because what I'm taking away is most of you would like to have some sort of sports go on.
I mean, the risk is there regardless, Bill. Like I said, I don't see that these kids are all just going to sit on the pitch in their house, their hands behind their backs. They're going to be out playing someplace else. They're playing no matter what, and so the risk is actually higher because they're playing against.
Rory, we can't hear you. I'm sorry, we can't hear you. I don't think so.
I do understand that situation and that many students are going to go out and play on other teams with different requirements for safety and things like that. But I mean, we're talking about school sanctioned risk. So we're putting on this program, and we're sending our students out to other schools. And that's our responsibility. I can't control what every family district does on their free time, and I wouldn't want to.
But the risk surely is to the community. The real risk is to the community. That's who we're trying to protect. And so they're at equal, if not worse, risk of not being involved in interscholastic sports, in my opinion. The risk doesn't go down to the community by not holding varsity or JV sports. It doesn't go down. They're going to be going out playing sports anyway.
But it's our responsibility. It's our responsibility to say whether or not this goes.
Understood.
I guess I feel comfortable with where we are. I really strongly feel like we, as a board, have an administrative proposal in front of us, and the amount of work that our administration has done over the last 6 months is so heroic that I really struggle with. I think that if we decided to say no to sports, I think that would be one thing. I think to say yes to sports, but we want to do it differently from how you've proposed, I just don't even, I feel like that's unfair to them to make them try to figure out another plan. I don't know. That I really struggle with. And I guess I feel some comfort in the fact that we're in a very fast changing environment. I think everyone has grown accustomed to that what we decide today could change tomorrow, right? I mean, tomorrow someone in our school district could test positive for COVID-19, and then, who knows what we're going to do. So whatever decision we make, there is still some fluidity to it. And I think that, Andrew, you've done a good job of reminding the community that. I think, Christian, in your communication about sports, you talked about it being fluid. I think the fact that we have a board meeting before contests will begin, and that's the piece of this that I have the biggest problem with approving, I guess. I'm comfortable that we'll have some data on how many kids are participating, how challenging it is to keep them in masks while they're practicing, and maybe that will inform us about whether we can move forward with contests. And I don't know if that's a reasonable thing to even consider. Like that, I guess we approve it knowing that 2 weeks from now we may change our mind. I don't know. Is that, everything's changing, right? So, I mean, if we say yes, but we start to see that, down county, they're starting to have, upticks of their numbers, I don't necessarily want to send our kids down county. So I don't know. That's where I am right now. I could be okay with not voting to cancel sports for the 2 weeks of practices prior to contest.
Okay, so yeah, I'm not hearing enough support to suggest a modification to this proposal. So I don't really think that's actually on the table at this moment. Really, what would have been on the table would have been a motion to not participate. And I think now we're sort of reaching a point where we're not hearing that there's going to be support for that. So nobody should feel put on the spot to make that motion. Honestly, where I feel we have landed is that we have heard a lot and learned a lot about the administration's presentation. We're very grateful for that opportunity. This is clearly a very, very complicated set of circumstances resulting in a difficult decision or difficult recommendation. And I'm not sure there's anything more that needs to be done or said. We're going to come back in a couple of weeks, and by then maybe teams will have been fielded and started to practice. But as has been mentioned, no contests will have occurred. So there is one more juncture to get an update, I suppose. So I think we are just ready to vote on the consent agenda then, if there are no further comments or questions about other items or this topic. Okay, all in favor of the consent agenda, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. And again, thank you very, very much for the extensive overview of what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. Thank you. And for all of the work that's gone into trying to support our athletes and all of our students. So that brings us to, let's see, bear with me one second. I think for dialogue, second. Lord knows we've had some board dialogue, but we have an opportunity for more.
Marjorie, I'd like to just say something not related to sports, and that's I just want to kind of give kudos to all the teachers, again, who have just been kind of, if you think about it, 2 weeks of juggling teaching online, teaching, they're doing synchronous as well as asynchronous and in person. I mean, they're really doing like 3 modalities, all at the same time. It's pretty remarkable. And at all the different grade levels, I'll just personally, I want to kind of just give a shout out to Mrs. Mangione at Increase Miller in 3rd grade. My daughter is having a really great experience in her class. And I, as a parent, and I think many teachers are doing this, they're communicating very efficiently and effectively, and it's helping everyone. I had a parent comment to me that, they saw Carrie Ford out there directing traffic during drop-off. I mean, she's clearly, doing a great job of orchestrating a very challenging situation when it comes to the transportation. And going back to the Meet the Teachers video kind of thing that had to happen this year in the middle school, again, I'll just use Mr. Stathis's video was awesome and kind of hilarious. And, again, just one of the reasons why my daughter is, I think, just really appreciating her experience so far. So just, those are just 3 examples that I'm personally kind of engaged with, but I know that's happening across all the grades and all the, classrooms, and, it's unprecedented times, and a lot of folks are really rising to the challenge. So I just wanted to make sure I said that publicly.
Thank you.
I would just want to add to that every employee probably is doing so many things differently. And I find myself thanking teachers a lot, as I should, because of their work directly with students. But whether it's people in our offices or bus drivers or monitors, like everyone's relearning how to work with students and how to support the work. So also a shout out to all those people behind the scenes who are doing things that we don't see because they're not at that point of contact necessarily with students, but they're making the student experience better. Just to build on what Terrence was saying.
Awesome. I'm glad you mentioned that, because earlier I was thinking to just, again, give a shout out to transportation, the drivers and everyone who's kind of out there. Again, my children were thrilled to see their bus driver. I'm just going to tell you that. They were really, really happy to see him. And, you know, I've said before, if something were not going well on the buses, they would have told me that really fast. And it seems like everything's going pretty well on our buses, at least. So again, I think transportation is doing a great job.
I know that transportation has been really challenging at all of our buildings, and maybe that will get better if there are opportunities to stay after school. It'll at least attenuate pickup, but we've had some really nice visibility into the buildings and the classrooms through curriculum night, you know, seeing teachers who recorded themselves in their classrooms, or at times administrators in the buildings. And there were webinars prior to the first day of school where we saw administrators walking through their buildings and pointing out some of the changes. But I wonder if it would be valuable, and I know the decision around transportation is a very personal choice, but to try to provide a little more insight into what it is like on the buses and the extensiveness of the protocols on the buses, to provide some extra reassurance. Might have a certain idea about how unsafe it feels to them to put their kids on the bus, but who might feel differently if they saw what the density looked like on the buses. I don't know how consistent the density is on the buses, but you know, if it is pretty widely held that the density is very low, for example, and certainly the bus drivers are doing extensive charting of the kids and where they're sitting and assigned seats and this and that, maybe more visibility around the extensiveness of the work that's being done to transport students safely would help some families make the decision not to do drop off and pick up. I don't know. It's just
a nice idea. Thank you. We'll look at that.
Okay, no further topics. Then we can look ahead to future meetings. The board's going to meet twice in October, Thursday, October 8th, 7:30 p.m. and then Thursday, October 22nd, 7:30 p.m. And at this time, I'm aware there's an audit committee meeting scheduled for Tuesday, September 29th at 7 o'clock. Did I miss anything? No. Okay. That brings us to our opportunity to adjourn. Would somebody like to make a motion to adjourn? Moved by Rory, seconded by Catherine. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Terrific. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good night. Be safe.
Thanks,
Take care.
Margie.
Thank you.